Sunday, February 18, 2001. The winter sky over Vienna, Virginia pressed low and colorless over the treetops of Foxstone Park, the kind of pale February sky that gave nothing away. No rain, no snow, just a flat gray ceiling that drained the afternoon of light and left a damp chill settling into everything it touched. The park was quiet in the way suburban parks are quiet on winter afternoons. The occasional dog walker crossing the path in the middle distance, the faint creak of bare branches, and the skeletal geometry of oaks and maples standing without ornament against the cold air. An unremarkable space, the sort of preserved strip of woodland threaded between housing developments that could be found in 100 Northern Virginia neighborhoods, useful as a shortcut and pleasant enough in spring, but on this particular Sunday offering little beyond a place to walk without being indoors. The man who entered the park from the parking area off Creek Crossing Road was 56 years old, heavy-set, wearing a dark overcoat against the February cold. He moved along the trail at a measured pace, not hurried enough to attract notice and not hesitant enough to suggest any uncertainty about his destination. He knew exactly where he was going. He had been to Foxstone Park before many times, and he knew the layout of the path as well as he knew the layout of his own backyard, which was only a short drive from here, in a house on Talisman Drive in Vienna where his wife and children had built a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. He knew the wooden footbridge about 200 yards along the trail, the one that crossed a shallow drainage ditch below the path, and he knew precisely where, beneath that bridge, he would complete the transaction that had brought him here. He carried nothing visible in his hands. His face was calm in the manner of a man doing something routine, something that years of repetition had stripped of tension. He had every reason to feel that way. He had done this before, and the system had never failed him. He would retrieve what his handlers had left, confirm the signal was clear, and walk back to his car in the same ordinary way he had arrived. Everything was under control. Everything was managed. It had been managed for longer than most people would believe. Through 2 decades and a career and multiple postings and 6 children and an active devotion to the Catholic faith and a senior role inside the most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States of America. His name was Robert Philip Hanssen. He carried the rank of Supervisory Special Agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For 22 years, beginning in 1979 and continuing until the Sunday afternoon when he walked into Foxstone Park for the last time, he had been selling the secrets of the United States government to the Soviet Union, and then to Russia. He reached the bridge, moved beneath it to the designated spot, and retrieved the package his handlers had left. The exchange was routine, or should have been. He turned and began walking back toward the parking lot, unhurried, contained. For the length of those first few steps, it must have seemed like every other time, every other afternoon he had slipped out to these quiet Virginia woods to complete the small mechanical rituals of a profession he had practiced longer than most intelligence careers last. Then the surveillance teams moved. They had been in position since before Hanssen arrived. Dozens of FBI special agents were distributed throughout the park and its perimeter, some on foot among the bare trees, some in cars parked quietly on the surrounding streets, some with cameras trained on the bridge from angles that left no gap in coverage. They had known he was coming. They had been certain for weeks, certain in the specific documents-in-hand way that transforms suspicion into something the law could act on. They had waited through the cold afternoon with the patience of people who know they do not need to rush because the outcome is already decided. When Hanssen straightened from beneath the bridge and started back toward the lot, the teams converged. They came from the trees and from the path ahead of him and from behind, professional in their silence and their coordination, turning the quiet afternoon trail into something else entirely. Hanssen stopped walking. He surveyed the faces closing in around him, faces he recognized in some cases from years of shared corridors and classified briefings and the particular familiarity that builds among people who work in the same building for a very long time. He understood immediately and completely what was happening. There was no sprint, no struggle, no desperate calculation about whether some other outcome was still possible. He stood, and he looked at the agents surrounding him, and according to the accounts of those present he said, quietly and without drama, 5 words. "What took you so long?" an FBI counterintelligence agent, senior, decorated, trusted with the nation's most sensitive secrets, who spent 22 years selling everything he knew to the Soviet Union and then to Russia. He chose his dead drop sites based on his intimate knowledge of how the FBI would search for them. He never met his handlers face to face. He set his own terms and the KGB accepted everyone. And when they finally caught him at that wooden bridge in Virginia, his only response was 5 words. If that kind of story gets under your skin, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. Robert Hanssen is the most damaging spy in American history, and this is the full account of how he did it. Those 5 words have passed into the institutional memory of American intelligence in a way that most arrest quotations never do, not because they were defiant, and not because they were contemptuous, but because of the quality they carried underneath the surface. A flat, almost weary matter-of-factness, as if the question were genuine. As if Robert Hanssen had been half expecting this moment for some time and was mildly curious, in the detached way of a man whose personal investment in the immediate outcome had already run its course, about what had finally changed. The more that investigators learned in the weeks and months and years that followed, the more they found that the question resisted a clean answer. The damage assessments that piled up in classified archives in the weeks after the arrest were staggering in their scope. More than 24 human sources who had provided intelligence to the United States were compromised or exposed. 3 men who had trusted American intelligence with their lives were handed by Hanssen directly to the service that would execute them, their names delivered in his very first letter to the KGB in 1985. A classified tunnel built at hundreds of millions of dollars of expense beneath the Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, one of the most ambitious technical intelligence operations the United States had ever attempted, was rendered useless before it had collected a single useful intercept, because Hanssen had told the Soviets it existed in the first year of its construction. American nuclear war planning documents. The identities of KGB officers working under diplomatic cover whose names were on FBI surveillance lists. The technical methods and analytical capabilities of the National Security Agency. The existence and details of classified continuity of government programs. Year after year, dead drop after dead drop, beneath bridges and in the hollows of signposts in quiet Virginia parks, Robert Hanssen had transferred the most sensitive holdings of the United States government to its principal adversary. He did it from inside FBI headquarters, with his bureau badge, with his counterintelligence clearances, from within the organization whose entire institutional purpose was to prevent exactly this from happening. The question of how one man could sustain this for 22 years without detection, from inside the counterintelligence division of the FBI, in a building full of people whose professional skill set was identifying and stopping people like him, would occupy investigators, commission reports, and intelligence reformers for years. The answers they found were not reassuring about the Bureau, about its culture, or about the systems it had put in place to protect the information it held. And the answers all led, eventually, back to a point much further in time than a park in Virginia, back to a house on the northwest side of Chicago, where a quiet and watchful boy was absorbing lessons about power and humiliation that no one around him recognized they were teaching. Robert Philip Hanssen was born on April 18, 1944, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the only child of Howard and Vivian Hanssen. His father was a Chicago police officer, and the family lived in a brick bungalow on the northwest side in the kind of working-class Catholic neighborhood that organized itself around the parish calendar and the neighborhood school and the shared understanding that decent people worked hard, caused no trouble, and raised their children accordingly. By every outward measure of the time and place, it was a stable and law-abiding origin. Howard Hanssen was not a demonstrably warm man. What he offered his son, consistently and with an almost systematic regularity, was doubt. He told Robert he was not intelligent enough to succeed. He questioned his decisions, dismissed his interests, and evaluated his accomplishments in ways that found them insufficient. The belittlement was not loud. It was administered in the quieter, more persistent register of a man who regarded his son with disappointment and considered it his fatherly obligation to make that disappointment known. No single incident defined it. The accumulation of small, repeated deflations was the point. Psychologists who later evaluated Hanssen extensively found this relationship foundational to everything that followed. The obsessive need to be recognized as the most intelligent person in any room, the structural contempt for authority that coexisted uneasily with the uniform and the badge, and the capacity to maintain an elaborate secret life as a form of private power, a reservoir of superiority that no institutional supervisor could reach or diminish. These were not casual observations drawn from thin evidence. They were the conclusions of professionals working from hundreds of hours of evaluation, and they pointed toward a character formed in the specific pressure of that Chicago household, shaped by a father who could not see what he was building. Robert Hanssen grew up carrying that formation with him, through Catholic schools and a carefully contained adolescence, into a life that would eventually prove his father spectacularly wrong about his intelligence, though not in any way either of them could have imagined. Vivian Hanssen kept a clean house, and the neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago kept its expectations clear. You attended Mass. You paid your bills. You raised children who reflected well on the family and on the parish, and you did not, under any ordinary circumstances, draw attention to yourself through excess or failure. These were the unspoken organizing principles of a community built from working-class Catholic stock, families who had arrived from various European countries over the previous generations and had arrived at a shared understanding that stability was worth more than distinction, and that the best life available to you was one constructed brick by careful brick from steady labor and quiet observance. Howard Hanssen belonged to this world in the sense that he lived in it and conformed to its outward requirements. He attended St. Paul of the Cross Parish with his family. He worked his shifts with the Chicago Police Department, came home with the kind of compressed, territorial authority that the job produced in men who spent their days exercising it, and established himself as the unavoidable gravitational center of the small household he ran. Vivian managed the domestic architecture of their lives with the practiced invisibility of a woman of her time and class. The meals, the laundry, the scheduling of Catholic school events, the management of a son who was quiet and watchful and clearly intelligent in ways that somehow failed to register as assets in his father's estimation. What Howard provided Robert consistently and across the years of childhood and adolescence was a running assessment of inadequacy. He told his son he was not smart enough to amount to anything significant. When Robert expressed ambitions, Howard found ways to shrink them. When Robert performed well academically, the response from his father was something closer to the damning adjustment of expectations than actual acknowledgement, as if the grade were what the minimum required, never evidence of anything genuinely worth noticing. The contempt was not the explosive kind that leaves obvious damage. It was the administered kind, the daily low dosage that accumulates over years in ways the recipient cannot easily name or locate but carries forward as a permanent interior weather. Robert himself spoke about this carefully and in controlled language during the post-arrest psychological evaluations conducted as part of his cooperation agreement with the Justice Department. The evaluations, summarized in the Inspector General's report published in 2003, described a man who had spent his life in the long shadow of that paternal dismissal, constructing an inner architecture that compensated for what had been taken away. The need to be recognized as the most intelligent person in any environment he entered. The chronic resentment toward institutional hierarchies that placed him beneath people he regarded as his inferiors. The particular pleasure he took in maintaining secrets, in possessing knowledge that others didn't have and couldn't access, as a form of power that no external authority could diminish. Robert attended St. Paul of the Cross Grammar School and then William Howard Taft High School, a large public school in the Norwood Park neighborhood where the students were mostly the children of the same working-class and lower-middle-class families that occupied the surrounding blocks. He was not the kind of student who announced his talents. He was quiet and contained in a way that could be read by teachers and classmates who weren't paying close attention as ordinary or unremarkable. He got good grades without apparent effort, which sometimes produced the perverse effect of having his intelligence underestimated, as if ease were evidence of shallow ability rather than a surplus of it. He had a few friends, stayed mostly to himself, and gave little away through his expression or his conversation about the interior world he was carefully protecting. His interests tended toward the technical and the systematic. Electronics fascinated him in the way that systems always fascinated him. Not as objects of tinkering, but as mechanisms to be understood at the level of principle, mapped and internalized until their behavior became predictable and their vulnerabilities visible. He was interested in how things were put together and, implicitly, in how they might be taken apart. This was the same quality of mind that would later make him an effective counterintelligence analyst and, simultaneously, an effective adversary of the organization he served. He could see systems from the outside, could hold the structure of a complex organization or a technical program in his mind as a unified whole and locate its weak points with the economy of someone who has been doing exactly this kind of analysis for as long as he can remember. After graduating from Taft High School, Hanssen enrolled at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, a small liberal arts school roughly 200 miles south and west of the city. He was there for 2 years before transferring to Northwestern University in Evanston, just north of Chicago on the lakefront, where the scale of the institution and the quality of the student body reflected something closer to the level at which he actually operated. He pursued a degree in chemistry, a discipline that suited his patience and his systematic approach to problem solving, and he performed well. Northwestern gave him proximity to a larger and more ambitious cohort of young Americans, and what he found there both confirmed his sense of his own abilities and sharpened his awareness of the gulf between those abilities and the recognition they received. He enrolled in Northwestern's dental school after completing his chemistry degree, apparently believing that medicine offered a more substantial career than chemistry alone. He stayed for approximately 1 year before concluding that dentistry was too narrow, too limited a theater for the kind of intellect he possessed. The decision to withdraw was characteristic. He did not struggle through a program that didn't suit him. He assessed his situation, determined it was wrong, and redirected. He returned to Northwestern to pursue an MBA in accounting, a choice that reflected a pragmatic calculation about employment rather than a passion for the field, and he completed it with the same methodical competence he applied to everything he studied. It was during his time at Northwestern in the late 1960s that he met Bernadette Walk. Everyone who knew her called her Bonnie, and she was, in almost every observable way, the counterweight that Hanssen's contained and guarded nature seemed to require from a partner. The Walk family was Catholic in the most thorough and committed sense of the word, not in the cultural parish-attending way that covered the neighborhood where Hanssen grew up, but in the way of people for whom faith was a genuine interior orientation, a framework for understanding the world and one's obligations within it. Bonnie was warm where Robert was cool, open where he was guarded, sincere in ways that appeared effortless. She was also someone whose family represented something he had not consistently encountered in his own, the modeling of faith as a source of genuine stability rather than mere social obligation. They married in August 1968. Robert was 24 years old. The union would prove, against all the evident pressures that would later be brought to bear against it, durable. Bonnie Hanssen would remain his wife through everything, through the years of secret keeping and the years of revelation and the 22 years of imprisonment that followed. She gave him 6 children and a domestic life that, from the outside and in many respects from the inside as well, genuinely resembled the Catholic family both of them had publicly committed to building. How much of that exterior represented Bonnie's actual experience and how much it concealed is something she kept largely to herself in the years after her husband's arrest, maintaining a protective silence that investigators and journalists rarely managed to penetrate. Immediately after the wedding, Hanssen worked at an accounting firm in Chicago, a position that his MBA qualified him for and that his disciplined, analytical mind was more than adequate to perform. It bored him. Not in the dramatic way of a man who makes his restlessness visible, but in the quiet, steady way of someone who has been assigned a task well beneath his capabilities and simply knows it. He lasted a few years in civilian accounting before concluding that he needed a different kind of work entirely. He applied to the Chicago Police Department, was accepted, and spent several years as an investigator before deciding correctly that the CPD was also not the right context. The scale was too local, the resources too thin, and the work too removed from the level at which he believed he was capable of operating. In 1975, he applied to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was accepted. He attended the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia, completed training with the methodical competence that everything about his background would predict, and received his first field assignment in 1976 in the Gary, Indiana resident agency, handling accounting fraud and white-collar crime cases. The work suited his skills in a narrow technical sense. He was precise and patient and thorough in the way that financial investigation requires. But Gary, Indiana was a starting point, not a destination. He was already looking toward the next assignment, the next stage, and the institutional context that would give him access to the kind of classified work that his particular interests and abilities were built for. Within a few years, that transfer came. He was reassigned to the FBI's New York City field office, to a posting in the Soviet Analytical Unit. It was, in the Cold War context of the late 1970s, some of the most important counterintelligence work the Bureau conducted. New York was home to one of the largest Soviet intelligence operations in the United States, an elaborate web of diplomats, United Nations officials, commercial representatives, and intelligence officers operating under various covers. The work of the Soviet Analytical Unit was to map that web, understand its structure, and identify the people inside it who were doing things that went beyond their stated purposes. Robert Hanssen was exactly the kind of officer the unit needed. He was analytically precise, technically capable, and already deeply familiar with the organizational logic of Soviet intelligence from his reading and his training. He settled into the work quickly and performed well. He also formed an opinion of his colleagues and supervisors that he kept largely to himself, but that was, by his lights, not flattering. He believed he was better at this than the people around him. He believed the Bureau, as an institution, was not using him at the level he deserved to be used. He was probably right on both counts, and that rightness, unacknowledged and unrewarded, was accumulating interest in the accounts of his private resentment. By 1979, Robert Hanssen had been in New York for roughly a year, working counterintelligence against Soviet intelligence, sitting inside one of the most sensitive classified environments in federal law enforcement, with access to assets and programs and analytical records that represented some of the most carefully protected intelligence the United States possessed. He also had a mortgage, a family, a salary that did not match his private estimation of his own value, and a mind that was beginning to rotate around a question he had never seriously posed to himself before: whether anyone would ever notice if he did something about it. The New York field office of the FBI occupied a building at Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan that announced its institutional identity through architecture alone: solid, governmental, implacable in the way that federal buildings of a certain era were designed to be, as if the stone itself were a statement about the permanence and seriousness of what happened inside. The city beyond its walls in the late 1970s was in a conspicuous state of distress. New York had come within a margin of fiscal collapse, its streets bearing the accumulated evidence of deferred maintenance and civic exhaustion, its subway system a remarkable daily act of controlled chaos. The federal government's presence in Lower Manhattan maintained its composed and institutional face against this backdrop, and the FBI's field office, one of the largest in the country, conducted its affairs with the focused purposefulness of an agency that had a great deal to do and some awareness that its methods and priorities were under scrutiny from several directions at once. Robert Hanssen arrived in this environment in 1978, transferred to the New York office after his initial assignment in the Gary, Indiana resident agency. His new posting placed him in the Soviet Analytical Unit, which was responsible for tracking, surveilling, and building dossiers on Soviet intelligence personnel operating in New York under the various covers that the city conveniently provided. The United Nations supplied a particularly useful institutional framework for Soviet intelligence activity, since it required a substantial Soviet diplomatic and administrative presence and granted those personnel the kinds of access and freedom of movement that made running an intelligence operation considerably more practical than in most American cities. The pool of potential contacts was large, the noise of international activity provided useful cover, and the city itself, with its millions of residents and its tolerance for anonymity, was a forgiving operational environment. The work was well matched to Hanssen's abilities. He was analytically methodical, capable of holding large amounts of information in structured relation to each other, and genuinely interested in understanding how the Soviet intelligence services were organized and how they operated. He read extensively about the KGB and the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, studied their organizational structures and their tradecraft, and approached the task of building assessments of Soviet personnel with a thoroughness that his supervisors noted was above the standard level. He was, technically and analytically, a good counterintelligence officer. This much was consistently acknowledged by the people who worked with him and later had to account for the fact that they had missed everything else. What they also noted in the same files and in the same retrospective accounts was that he was difficult. Not difficult in ways that triggered any formal concern, but difficult in the interpersonal manner of someone who made his low opinion of his colleagues and supervisors felt through the quality of his attention rather than through open confrontation. He was condescending in the way that very intelligent and insecure people sometimes are, a slight elevation in formality, a precision of language that implied the person he was speaking with would struggle to follow if he were less careful, a capacity for silence in meetings that was not quite passive but not quite engaged either. He had opinions about how the office should function, about the competence of the people running it, and about what should be prioritized in the Bureau's handling of the Soviet account. He generally kept these opinions below the level of direct insubordination, but the opinions were present and the edge they gave him was felt. His colleagues found him hard to read and harder to befriend, which was consistent with the way Robert Hanssen navigated most social environments. He was not a person who built the casual alliances of office life, the coffee conversations and after-work drinks and shared complaints about management that create the collegial texture of a functioning workplace. He existed at a slight remove from all of that, as if the normal social infrastructure of the office were something he observed from a distance and found mildly contemptible. He had a family at home in New Jersey, in Bernadette and the children, and a faith life organized around Catholic practice that gave his personal world a coherence that the professional one, in his estimation, consistently failed to provide. Bonnie and the children had followed him from Chicago to the New York suburbs, settling into the kind of suburban New Jersey community that housed a significant portion of the FBI personnel assigned to the New York field office. They attended Mass regularly, enrolled the children in Catholic school, and built the rhythms of family life with the reliability that Bonnie brought to everything she undertook. The household had a stability to it that was genuine, not performed. Whatever Hanssen was privately constructing during these years, the exterior of his domestic life was not a facade in the way that some doubles subsequently turn out to have maintained. He was a real presence in the family. He attended the children's events. He was home for dinner. He was not the careless or absent or visibly troubled father that one might expect from someone harboring what he was harboring. This compartmentalization, the ability to maintain a fully functioning family life in one chamber of his existence while a completely separate and operationally demanding operation ran in another, was identified by the psychologists who later studied him as one of the most characteristic features of his psychology and one of the most significant factors in his long operational survival. Most people cannot sustain this kind of sustained dual identity without some visible leakage. The stress that shows in behavior, the inconsistencies that accumulate into suspicious patterns, the emotional weight that eventually finds expression in ways that attract notice. Hanssen seemed to maintain the separation with an almost architectural rigor. The compartments did not communicate. What happened in one did not appear to affect the other, at least not in any way that was visible to the people around him. He was also, and this is important to understanding what happened next, developing an increasingly refined understanding of how counterintelligence investigations worked, what they looked for, and where their systematic limitations lay. He was not a passive student of his own profession. He was studying it the way a chess player studies not just the rules of the game but the tendencies of the specific opponents likely to be sitting across the table. He knew that the FBI's Soviet counterintelligence apparatus, like any large institutional operation, had habitual approaches and organized assumptions that created predictable blind spots. He had read about historical espionage cases with the attention of someone who was not merely curious but was performing a kind of due diligence on a decision he had not yet made but was beginning to consider seriously. At some point in 1979, the consideration resolved into a decision. The precise internal sequence of that resolution is something that investigators, psychologists, and journalists have spent considerable effort trying to reconstruct from the evidence available, including Hanssen's own guarded accounts during his post-arrest debriefing. What emerges is not a single dramatic moment of resolve, but something more gradual and more prosaic. A man who had been sitting inside a volume of extremely valuable classified information, who believed his institutional rewards were inconsistent with his capabilities, and who had the analytical confidence to believe he could manage the risks involved in doing something about it. The financial dimension was real. An FBI agent's salary in the late 1970s was stable and respectable but not generous, and Hanssen had a family, a mortgage, and the ongoing expenses of the Catholic school education he and Bonnie were committed to providing their children. He did not live extravagantly, but he did have ambitions for his family that outpaced what the government paid him to protect its secrets. Money was a genuine motivator, not a peripheral one. But the money alone does not fully account for the decision, because the money he would receive, while significant, was never going to make Robert Hanssen wealthy in any conspicuous way. He never bought yachts or vacation homes or made the kind of purchases that blew the cover of contemporaries like Aldrich Ames, who rented his suits and drove a Jaguar on a CIA analyst's salary and seemed almost to dare the institution to notice. Hanssen spent his Soviet income carefully, kept most of it in cash, and was fastidious about not allowing his spending to rise noticeably above what his government salary could plausibly support. The money mattered, but it was not the center of the exercise. The center, as best as anyone has been able to determine, was something considerably closer to what his childhood had built into the architecture of his character. He wanted to be the most important person in a competition that no one else in the room knew was being held. He wanted to operate at a level that proved, definitively and without appeal, the judgment his father had delivered wrong. He wanted the private knowledge that among all the people in the FBI's New York field office, among all the counterintelligence professionals and supervisors and special agents who carried their own self-assessments like invisible credentials, he was the one who understood what was really happening. He was the one running the real operation. He picked up the phone and then thought better of it. A phone call had too much risk. A direct approach to a known Soviet intelligence officer was similarly exposed. What he settled on was something that reflected the tradecraft instincts already at work in him. He identified a Soviet commercial front operation with connections to the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, operating in New York City. He walked into it and identified himself as a federal agent with access to information of considerable value. It was an act of audacity that should, by any reasonable probability calculation, have ended his espionage career before it properly started. He was a relatively new officer without practiced field tradecraft, approaching a Soviet intelligence-connected entity with essentially no cover and no prior arrangement. He could have been reported, identified, and walked into a counterintelligence investigation within days. He was not, partly because of his own careful initial presentation, and partly because the GRU, receiving what looked like a genuine walk-in from a bureau officer with real access, had reason to be cautious but more reason to be interested. The relationship that followed was, from the beginning, structured on Hanssen's terms. He would decide what to provide. He would decide how to communicate. He would not give his real name. He would not meet anyone face to face beyond this initial contact. He would set the parameters of the exchange and expect compliance if they wanted what he had to offer. Most intelligence services receiving this kind of approach from an untested source would push back, would insist on more control, would treat it as a negotiation. The GRU, weighing the quality of the initial material Hanssen demonstrated he could deliver, accepted his terms. Robert Hanssen walked out of that building in New York carrying the fact of his decision like a new weight, permanent and private, completely invisible from the outside. He was an FBI counterintelligence officer and he had just become a spy. He was 35 years old, and the next phase of his life had begun. The first question any intelligence service asks about a walk-in source is not whether the information they bring is accurate. The first question is whether the source is genuine, whether the approach is a legitimate offer from someone with real access, or whether it is a provocation, a dangle arranged by the other side to embarrass, to deceive, or to plant false information in your analytical process. The GRU handled Robert Hanssen's initial approach in 1979 with the caution that this uncertainty required. They listened. They assessed the quality of the preliminary material he provided. And they made a determination that he was real. He was more than real. He was, from the perspective of Soviet military intelligence, something extraordinarily rare. A serving FBI counterintelligence officer, assigned to the unit responsible for tracking Soviet intelligence activities in New York, offering access to some of the most sensitive material in American counterintelligence holdings. The value of what he represented was difficult to overstate. Most recruited assets took months or years of cultivation to develop. They required handling, management, the gradual extension of trust, and the gradual calibration of what they could deliver. Hanssen arrived with the access already in place, the motive already established, the security protocols already self-imposed, and the material already in hand. He was, in the tradecraft terminology of the intelligence world, a walk-in who arrived fully formed. What he offered in those initial exchanges was enough to confirm the GRU's assessment of his value. Among the material he provided was information that led to the identification of assets the United States had spent years carefully protecting. The most significant of these, and the one whose fate has occupied the most attention in the subsequent accounting of Hanssen's damage, was a man known to American intelligence by the cryptonyms Top Hat and Bourbon. Dmitry Fedorovich Polyakov was, by the consensus of the intelligence professionals who ran and later wrote about his case, one of the most valuable human intelligence sources the CIA ever developed inside the Soviet military establishment. He had been providing intelligence to the United States since the early 1960s, operating from within the GRU itself, rising through the ranks to the position of Major General while simultaneously feeding a stream of extraordinarily sensitive intelligence to his American handlers. The information he provided over more than 2 decades of service touched almost every dimension of Soviet military capability. The doctrines that governed Soviet war planning, the performance characteristics of weapons systems that American planners needed to understand, the identities of Soviet intelligence officers posted abroad, and the internal deliberations of Soviet military leadership in ways that shaped the United States government's understanding of what it was actually facing across the Cold War divide. He was also a man of unusual courage, of the specific and quiet kind that sustained dangerous work over a very long period without the dramatic episodes that make good stories but rarely characterize actual operations. He managed his dual roles with the steadiness of someone who had made a decision about which side of history he wanted to be on and had concluded that the risk was acceptable. His American handlers regarded him as a professional in the deepest sense of the word, someone whose value lay not just in what he delivered but in the reliability and discipline with which he delivered it. When Robert Hanssen provided his GRU contact with information that pointed toward Polyakov's identity, he set in motion a sequence of events whose full consequences would not manifest for years. Polyakov was not arrested immediately. The Soviets understood the value of maintaining a compromised source in place for a period, watching what access they were being given, assessing what the Americans believed the source was providing, and using the knowledge of the compromise as a tool before pulling the trigger on an arrest that would reveal they knew. Polyakov continued to operate, continued to meet with his American handlers, continued to provide intelligence, for years after Hanssen had handed him to the people who would ultimately kill him. He was arrested in 1986. He was executed in 1988. The question of who killed Dmitry Polyakov is one that intelligence historians have continued to debate, because Hanssen was not the only person who eventually provided information that contributed to his compromise. Aldrich Ames, the CIA officer who ran his own parallel espionage program from 1985 to 1994, also provided the KGB with details that pointed to Polyakov. The Soviets, by the mid-1980s, had multiple streams of information confirming what they suspected about the general, which is part of why they waited as long as they did before acting. The convergence of intelligence from multiple compromised Americans allowed them to be confident in their assessment before making a move that would be irreversible. But this distributed nature of the damage does not dilute Hanssen's specific contribution to it. He was, in 1979, among the first to provide information about Polyakov to Soviet intelligence. He did it with full knowledge of what the information was and what would happen to the person it identified. He did it for money and for the private satisfaction of demonstrating his own capabilities, and he showed no subsequent evidence of having been troubled by it. When investigators pressed him on this point during debriefing sessions after his arrest, Hanssen's responses displayed the particular quality that would characterize much of his cooperation. Technically precise within narrow boundaries, carefully constructed to provide the minimum required rather than the full picture, and entirely free of any apparent emotional engagement with the human consequences of what he had done. For approximately 2 years, from 1979 to 1981, Hanssen provided the GRU with a flow of intelligence that the subsequent damage assessment would characterize as significant. He was careful in the mechanics of these exchanges. He insisted on protocols that protected him above all other considerations. He met with his GRU contacts only for initial arrangements and then moved to a system of impersonal exchange wherever possible, preferring the dead drop method, the leaving of materials at prearranged locations without face-to-face contact, because it eliminated the most dangerous vulnerability in any human intelligence operation, the moment when two people who should not be seen together are in fact seen together. In 1981, he paid approximately $30,000 in total receipts for 2 years of work that had compromised some of the most protected intelligence the United States possessed. He took that money home to Bonnie and the children and the house in New Jersey and the round of Catholic school events and Sunday masses and the evening dinners that constituted the other and outwardly intact life he was maintaining in parallel. Bonnie discovered it. The exact nature of what she found has been reconstructed from multiple accounts, including her own, and the full details remain somewhat uncertain. What is established is that she encountered evidence, financial records, documents, something that constituted discovery rather than merely suspicion, and that she confronted Robert about it. His response was to admit, in a version of events that he was careful to keep below the full and criminal truth, that he had been providing information to the Soviets in exchange for payment. He acknowledged enough to satisfy her immediate demand for an explanation without acknowledging the full extent of what he had done or the identities of the people he had put at risk in the process. Bonnie was a woman of deep and disciplined religious faith, and her response to what her husband told her was organized by that faith. She did not contact law enforcement. She did not, as far as any record indicates, consult anyone outside the structure of the church. She told Robert that he needed to confess to a priest and receive spiritual counsel, and that whatever penance was assigned needed to be undertaken seriously. This was not naivety on her part. It was the expression of a framework in which the path to addressing this kind of transgression ran through the sacrament rather than through the law, and in which Robert's own spiritual accountability was the mechanism through which the damage was to be repaired. Hanssen went to confession. The priest who heard his account counseled him to donate the money he had received from the Soviets to a religious charity and to cease his activities entirely. Hanssen donated some of the money, reportedly to a mission associated with the Missionaries of Charity, the organization founded by Mother Teresa, and kept the rest. Whether the priest was told sufficient detail to understand what he was actually absolving is a question that cannot be answered from the available record. What can be said is that whatever was communicated in that confessional did not result in any external action, and that Hanssen subsequently represented himself to Bonnie as having fulfilled the prescribed penance and ended his involvement with Soviet intelligence. In the most essential sense, he had stopped. The exchanges with the GRU ceased. He returned to the rhythms of his FBI career and his family life, maintaining the single visible life rather than the two, and allowing approximately 4 years to pass in what appeared to be, from the outside, ordinary professional and domestic regularity. He was transferred from New York. He worked various bureau postings with the same contained competence that had always characterized his professional performance. He said nothing to anyone about what he had done or what he knew, which was quite a lot. He had built a system and proven it worked. He had managed a relationship with Soviet intelligence for 2 years, from inside the counterintelligence division of the FBI, with no detection and no consequence beyond the domestic discovery that Bonnie had forced into the light and that the architecture of their faith had, in a sense, contained. The confession had served, from Hanssen's perspective, as both spiritual accounting and practical management. an acknowledgement that resolved the immediate crisis without triggering legal consequences or professional exposure. He had also learned something concrete and important about himself, the compartmentalization held. Under direct domestic pressure, confronted by the person he was closest to in the world, he had managed the disclosure with enough control to prevent it from becoming the kind of exposure that would end his career and his freedom. He had confirmed, in the most demanding test available to him, that his ability to separate the two lives was genuine and durable. He would not forget that. The 4 years between 1981 and 1985 passed without incident, at least in the sense that nothing external forced any crisis or decision. Hanssen worked his FBI assignments with the same ability that had always characterized his professional performance, moved through various postings, and gave nothing away to the colleagues and supervisors who shared his professional environment. He was assigned to counterintelligence work in Washington for a period, which is a detail worth holding in mind. A man who had spent 2 years selling secrets to Soviet military intelligence was reassigned to the Bureau's counterintelligence apparatus, where he continued to accumulate access to the very category of classified information he had previously sold. The FBI had no idea. There was nothing to indicate that it should. Bonnie maintained her faith that the chapter was closed. She had done what the framework of her belief required. She had brought the matter into the light through confession, had ensured that penance was assigned, and had trusted the process. There is no evidence that she had any contact with law enforcement or made any report to the Bureau. Within the logic of her world, the matter had been addressed through the appropriate channels. Robert had confessed. He had donated the money. The priest had given absolution. The marriage continued. The family continued. The external shape of their life remained intact because in all the ways that Bonnie could observe, it was intact. What she could not observe was the interior recalibration that was occurring in the years of relative quiet, the slow and private re-examination of the calculation that had produced the first period of espionage and then suspended it. Hanssen had stopped not because he was afraid or because he had been genuinely converted to a different view of what he was doing. He had stopped because Bonnie's discovery had introduced a risk factor he had not fully anticipated, and because managing that risk required a period of operational dormancy. He was not done. He was waiting. In the intervening years, the landscape around him shifted in ways that made the decision he would eventually make more focused and more targeted. He moved through FBI postings, handling intelligence and counterintelligence work, and his access and his understanding of the classified environment continued to deepen. He became, if anything, more knowledgeable about the specific secrets the United States most needed to protect and about the systems and procedures designed to protect them. He was also, in these years, watching the development of computer systems within the FBI with particular attention, pushing for their adoption in intelligence analysis with a foresight that was genuinely ahead of the Bureau's institutional curve. His technology instincts were real, and his understanding of what computer systems could do for intelligence work was sophisticated. He was not simply a spy. He was a legitimately skilled intelligence professional, and the combination of genuine competence and genuine treachery made him harder to identify, not easier. By 1985, the decision was made. He would resume contact with Soviet intelligence. But this time he would not go to the GRU. This time he would go directly to the KGB. The KGB, the Committee for State Security, was the principal Soviet intelligence and security service, the far larger and better resourced organization, the one that ran human intelligence collection operations against the United States at the highest levels. The GRU was effective within its military intelligence mandate, but the KGB was the service that held the most comprehensive files, ran the most significant assets, and carried the greatest institutional weight within the Soviet state. If Hanssen was going to resume this work, he was going to provide his material to the organization best positioned to use it. He wrote a letter. The act of writing a letter to the Washington residency of the KGB, addressed to a specific senior officer, is one of the details of Hanssen's story that continues to produce a particular quality of disbelief in the people who study it carefully. He did not arrange an intermediary. He did not engineer an indirect contact through layers of deniable connections. He wrote a letter, apparently typed, addressed to Viktor Cherkashin, the KGB's counterintelligence chief at the Soviet Embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, and he sent it to the Soviet Embassy. He provided enough material in that initial communication to demonstrate that he was genuine and that he had access worth cultivating. He demanded $100,000 in exchange for what he was offering, and consistent with the operational protocols he had established in his first round of contact with the GRU, he provided no real name. He signed the letter with cash demands and specifics, and left his identity a deliberate blank. This letter arrived at the Soviet Embassy in Washington at approximately the same time that another extraordinary event was unfolding in Soviet counterintelligence. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer, was making his own initial approach to the Soviets through direct contact at a lunch meeting. The spring of 1985 would later be identified by intelligence historians as perhaps the single most consequential season in the Cold War intelligence war. Within weeks of each other, two senior American intelligence officers independently decided to sell their country's secrets, and both of them landed in the files of Viktor Cherkashin, who was having a professionally remarkable spring. Cherkashin, who later wrote about these events in his memoir, understood immediately that the letter he received from the unsigned source was significant. The level of specific, verifiable intelligence the writer demonstrated he possessed was too detailed and too accurate to be fabricated. This was not a provocation or a carefully constructed deception operation mounted by American intelligence. This was a real source with real access, and the demand for $100,000 was a straightforward professional transaction of the kind Soviet intelligence was entirely prepared to conduct. The response to Hanssen's letter confirmed that the arrangement was accepted. The $100,000 in cash was left at a dead-drop location that Hanssen specified. He had done it by mail, without a face-to-face meeting, without compromising his physical anonymity, and in exchange for funds that represented a significant multiple of what the GRU had paid him for 2 years of work in the early 1980s. The relationship was established on his terms. It would continue more or less on those same terms for the next 16 years. Hanssen's insistence on the specific structure of the relationship he would maintain with the KGB reflected both his security instincts and, in a deeper sense, his understanding of where the power in the arrangement actually resided. Most intelligence services regard the handler-source relationship as one in which the service maintains organizational authority. They set the communication protocols, determine the dead-drop locations, manage the scheduling, and generally treat the source as a valuable but ultimately subordinate element in their operational framework. Hanssen refused this arrangement from the outset and maintained his refusal consistently through his entire career. He chose the dead-drop locations. He determined the signal procedures. He selected the geographic areas where packages would be left and retrieved. He imposed the rule against face-to-face meetings with absolute firmness, and this rule held for the entirety of his career as a Soviet and then Russian asset. 22 years of active espionage without a single in-person meeting with a handler. This is so unusual in the history of intelligence operations that it merits emphasis. The dead drop, as a communication method, eliminates the most dangerous moment in any spy operation: the contact. It removes the possibility of the source being observed with a handler, removes the possibility of a handler being surveilled whose movements might then be traced back to a source, and in Hanssen's hands it also removed the possibility that any Soviet or Russian officer would ever be in a position to identify him in a way that could, if that officer were arrested or defected or decided to sell what he knew, lead directly back to the FBI field office on Pennsylvania Avenue. He maintained anonymity to a degree that seemed, to the KGB officers managing his file, almost pathological. He was known in their documentation as B, and later as Ramon Garcia. He communicated in writing, offering details about his professional environment that were vague enough to protect his identity while specific enough to confirm his bona fides. The Soviets, for their part, found this arrangement frustrating but acceptable, because what the anonymous correspondent was delivering justified the inconvenience of not knowing his face. What he delivered in the immediate aftermath of that first 1985 letter was, by any measure, devastating. In the very first substantive communication he made after the initial monetary exchange was confirmed, Hanssen provided the KGB with 3 names: the names of 3 individuals who were operating as intelligence sources for the United States within Soviet intelligence, specifically within the KGB's own Washington operation. The specificity of those 3 names, provided in that first communication, tells you almost everything you need to know about the kind of operational security that had kept Hanssen undetected for 2 years in the early 1980s and would keep him undetected for 16 more. He did not offer general information. He did not test the relationship with peripheral intelligence. He provided the names of 3 human beings who trusted the United States with their lives in the first communication, and the KGB acted on those names. Those 3 men were Valery Martinov, Sergei Motorin, and Boris Yuzin. What happened to them is the part of Robert Hanssen's story that no accumulation of analytical distance or institutional abstraction can fully insulate against the weight of. To understand the mechanics of what Robert Hanssen was operating within, you first have to understand the specific world he inhabited professionally, because the architecture of that world determined the scale of what he could betray. By 1985, Hanssen had moved through several FBI postings and had accumulated a depth of access and institutional knowledge that most bureau officers, even those of comparable seniority, did not possess. He understood the Soviet counterintelligence account from the inside, not just as a reader of finished intelligence products, but as someone who had worked the raw material, who had been present in the operational discussions, and who had built over years a mental map of which programs were most sensitive, which assets were most significant, and where the junctions were between what the FBI knew and what the CIA and NSA were doing in parallel. The dead drop system that he and the KGB established and refined over the years following his initial 1985 communication was a model of operational discipline, constructed with the specific awareness that its architect understood exactly how the FBI would go about trying to find it if they were looking in the right direction. A dead drop works on the principle of temporal separation. The person leaving the material and the person collecting it are never in the same place at the same time, never in contact, and never in a position where a third party could observe both of them together and draw conclusions about their relationship. The locations, chosen by Hanssen from among parks and wooded areas and suburban signposts and highway overpasses around Northern Virginia and the Washington area, were selected with attention to sight lines, pedestrian traffic patterns, and the difficulty of maintaining covert surveillance without detection. The signals were simple and low technology by design. A strip of white adhesive tape fixed to a specific post or railing indicated that a drop was ready. The tape was the kind of marking that thousands of people might fix to thousands of objects for thousands of reasons, unremarkable in itself and only meaningful to someone who knew exactly what it indicated. Hanssen insisted on exchanging packages for cash and diamonds. He preferred diamonds as a component of payment because they were compact, portable, and effectively untraceable. And the packages he left contained materials that he prepared with meticulous care, removing or avoiding anything that might carry identifying marks, fingerprints, or forensic traces that could be used to narrow the pool of possible sources. He communicated with his handlers in writing, using typed letters that similarly avoided identifying characteristics. His prose style in these communications was, by all accounts, formal and precise, the product of someone who understood that how you write carries information about who you are, and who edited that information carefully. He made no casual references that might triangulate toward his specific position in the Bureau. He did not share biographical details. He offered the analytical assessments and operational specifics that confirmed his access without revealing the personal coordinates that might allow his identity to be deduced. The KGB's side of the relationship was managed with an attentiveness that reflected how significant they considered the source. They responded to his communications through the dead drop system, left the cash and diamonds he requested at the locations he designated, and worked within the constraints he imposed without the resistance that might have characterized their handling of a less valuable asset. They referred to him internally with a degree of care about protecting the source file that was itself an indicator of how seriously they regarded what they were receiving. The asset file on B and later Ramon Garcia was held closely, compartmentalized even within the KGB's internal structure, which was standard practice for the highest value assets but which would, ironically, later become a critical factor in keeping Hanssen operational for as long as he was. The operational framework that governed the relationship was, in effect, a collaboration between a man who understood how American counterintelligence operations were identified and a service that understood how to manage a source without triggering those operations. The result was a channel of information transfer that ran, with interruptions, for 16 years after the 1985 resumption, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, through the rise of post-Soviet Russia, and through the substantial reorganization of both the U.S. intelligence community and its Russian counterpart. The information that moved through this channel during the late 1980s was extraordinary in breadth and in damage. But what moved through it first, in the very initial period of communication, was something whose damage was immediate, specific, and measured in human lives. The three names that Hanssen provided in his opening communications to the KGB in 1985 were not peripheral or low-value cases. They were not the kind of intelligence that sat in files for years without practical consequence. They were the identities of three individuals actively operating inside the KGB's Washington residency or in Soviet intelligence organizational structures that were being heavily worked by the FBI and CIA. Identifying these individuals and providing their names to the service they were reporting against was, from Hanssen's perspective, a proof of capability demonstration. Here is what I know and how much I know it. From the perspective of Soviet counterintelligence, receiving those names was like being handed a roadmap through their own security failures. They now knew, based on a source they had validated as genuine and well-positioned, exactly who inside their own structures had been reporting to the Americans. The question was how to act on this knowledge in a way that minimized the information to the Americans about the fact of the discovery, used the compromised assets to feed misinformation where possible, and ultimately neutralized the damage without advertising how the exposure had been obtained. The handling of all three cases followed a pattern that was recognizable in Soviet counterintelligence practice. Rather than immediately and dramatically arresting the identified individuals, the Soviets allowed them to continue operating for a period, watched what they passed and received, and eventually arranged for their recall to Moscow through pretexts that would not immediately be traceable to a specific source of compromise. The mechanics of the recall varied, but the outcome was consistent. Once back in the Soviet Union, removed from the operational environment in Washington and from the protective proximity of the American embassy and American diplomatic protocols, the recalled individuals were in a position from which they could not easily be recovered or extracted. The KGB's Washington residency in the mid-1980s operated within the Soviet embassy compound and drew its personnel from Soviet officials operating under diplomatic cover, legitimate in their official functions but using the access and freedom of movement that diplomatic status provided to conduct intelligence activities. It was a world of careful social navigation, professional performance of role, and the constant low-level tension of people who knew they were being watched by American intelligence and who were simultaneously watching back. Within this environment, the FBI and CIA maintained a small but significant network of sources who were providing information about the residency's activities, personnel, and operations. Hanssen had direct knowledge of this network or significant portions of it through his work in the Bureau's counterintelligence apparatus. The three men he named were not theoretical or speculative intelligence to him. He knew who they were, understood the operational significance of what they had been providing, and was aware of the care that had been taken to protect their identities and their access. Providing those names to the KGB was not an act of abstraction or distant betrayal. It was a specific and fully informed decision to hand three human beings by name to the people whose job it was to deal with people who had betrayed Soviet intelligence. Whatever accommodation Robert Hanssen made in his own mind for this act, whatever compartmentalization of the human reality he performed in order to make it possible, is something that the documentary record does not fully illuminate. His post-arrest debriefings were extensive but guarded, shaped by his awareness that his cooperation agreement limited what could be used against him and by a characteristic preference for providing information about operational mechanics rather than motivations or emotional logic. He discussed tradecraft with precision and relative openness. He was considerably less forthcoming about the interior experience of what he was doing. What is clear is that he made the decision, acted on it decisively, and then continued. He did not stop after the three names. He did not pause to assess the consequences of the initial disclosures before proceeding. He continued to pass intelligence, continued to collect his payments at the designated dead drops, and continued to maintain the parallel professional life at the FBI that provided both his cover and his access. The first period of the KGB relationship, from 1985 to 1991, produced a sustained and regular flow of some of the most valuable intelligence the Soviet Union received from American sources during the Cold War era. The operational partnership, for that is what it was, despite Hanssen's insistence that he was always in control of the terms, had been established cleanly and efficiently. The dead drop system was functioning. The communication protocols were secure. The payments were being made. And somewhere within the Washington counterintelligence apparatus, where analysts spent their days trying to understand what the Soviets knew and how they knew it, the evidence of extraordinary losses was beginning to accumulate, visible in the pattern of blown operations and compromised assets but unattributable to any specific source that investigators could identify or locate. The losses were real and they were enormous, but the FBI was looking outward, toward the Soviet personnel it surveilled and the CIA assets it supported, toward all the places a leak might originate that were not inside the building where the investigators themselves worked. It was perhaps the most significant institutional failure of the American intelligence community's Cold War history. The assumption, built into the culture and the procedures, that the FBI's own officers were not the problem. That assumption would cost years. And it would cost lives. Valery Martinov was 38 years old when he was recalled to Moscow in November 1985. He was a KGB officer serving in Washington under diplomatic cover, working in the science and technology section of the Soviet residency, and he had been reporting to both the FBI and the CIA since approximately 1982. He had made a choice, years earlier, to work against the service he officially represented, for reasons that included professional disillusionment with the Soviet system and a personal conviction that what he was doing was worth the risk. He was a professional and a father, and by the accounts of the American officers who handled his case, he was someone who took the work seriously and who had built, over 3 years of operation in Washington, a relationship of mutual trust with the people on the American side who managed his case. In November 1985, Martinov was on the official party accompanying Vitaly Yurchenko back to Moscow. Yurchenko was a KGB officer who had defected to the Americans earlier that year and had then, in one of the more dramatic episodes of Cold War intelligence history, redefected back to the Soviet Union at a Washington restaurant in early November, claiming his original defection had been coerced. Martinov traveled back with the official party as one of several Soviet personnel coordinating the return. He was told his presence was required for a brief period. He was told he would be returning to Washington. He was not returning to Washington. The American side of his case noticed immediately that something had gone wrong, but the mechanics of how the knowledge of his compromise had reached the KGB were not understood. What was understood was that a man who had been trusted by the United States and who had risked everything to provide intelligence of genuine value had gone back to Moscow and had not come back at his expected time, and that the signals indicating his continued operation were silent in ways that professionals recognized as final. Valery Martinov was arrested on his return to Moscow. He was subjected to the interrogation procedures of the KGB's counterintelligence directorate, procedures whose specific character the Soviet state did not advertise but whose outcomes were well understood by anyone who had spent time studying the organization's history. He was convicted of treason against the Soviet state. On March 28, 1987, he was executed. Sergei Motorin's story runs closely parallel. Motorin was also a KGB officer serving at the Soviet embassy in Washington, and he had also been recruited as an American intelligence asset, in his case after being placed in a compromised position that the FBI had used as leverage to develop him as a source. He too was recalled to Moscow. He too was arrested. He too was subjected to the accounting that Soviet counterintelligence demanded of people who had worked for the other side. Sergei Motorin was executed in February 1987, weeks before Martinov met the same end. Two men, colleagues in the same organization, both recalled to Moscow within months of each other, both arrested, both tried, both executed. The timing of their recall, both in the fall and winter of 1985, was not coincidental. It tracked almost exactly with the period following Hanssen's first communication with the KGB in the spring of that year, when he had provided their names along with the other material demonstrating his access. The connection between that communication and their deaths is documented in the Justice Department's subsequent investigation, and is not disputed. It should also be noted that Aldrich Ames provided information about Martinov and Motorin independently from his initial contact with Soviet intelligence in the spring of 1985. Both Hanssen and Ames, working from their separate positions and without any knowledge of each other, reached the same men as targets of disclosure. For Martinov and Motorin, the convergence of two separate American traitors pointing to their names in the same season made their fate overdetermined in the worst possible way. The question of which disclosure initiated the mechanism of their recall is one that intelligence historians have examined carefully. The conclusion is that Hanssen's communication arrived at the KGB residency and was acted upon. Ames's confirmation, coming through a different channel, reinforced the existing knowledge. The practical difference in outcome for the two men is not measurable. They are equally dead. Boris Yuzin's story diverges from the other two in a single critical respect. He survived. Yuzin was a KGB officer who had been approached by the FBI in San Francisco in the early 1980s while serving under journalistic cover, and who had agreed to report on Soviet intelligence activities to the Americans. He was operating in a different geographic context from Martinov and Motorin, and he was managed through a separate set of handlers. When Hanssen provided his name to the KGB, the chain of consequences that followed was slower and, in Yuzin's case, did not produce an immediate recall. He was eventually arrested in 1986, the year following Hanssen's disclosure. The charges against him were treason. He was sentenced to 15 years in Soviet labor camps, a sentence whose conditions in the late Soviet prison system were sufficient to constitute, for many people assigned to them, a death sentence by another method. Yuzin survived the camps, a fact that reflects both his resilience and, in some measure, the particular contingency of survival under conditions that are designed to eliminate without quite guaranteeing elimination. He was released and amnestied in 1992, after the Soviet Union's dissolution and under the government of Boris Yeltsin, and he subsequently emigrated to the United States, where he settled in the Bay Area and built a life at an extreme remove from the world that had nearly consumed him. When investigators later assembled the full account of Yuzin's case and its connection to Hanssen, Yuzin himself spoke on occasion about the experience, though with the measured restraint of a man who had processed what happened to him over the course of years and arrived at a place that was something other than the raw anger its origins would justify. The American intelligence community's failure to protect him, the specific act by a specific officer in the FBI that had put him in a Soviet labor camp for 6 years, was an objective fact that no accumulation of institutional apology could undo. The three cases together, Martinov, Motorin, and Yuzin, represent the most immediately devastating human consequence of Hanssen's 1985 reactivation. They were not the only people he harmed. They were not the only people who suffered serious damage as a direct result of specific disclosures he made to Soviet and Russian intelligence. But they were the most proximate, the most clearly traceable, and the most unambiguously fatal, and their cases anchor the moral accounting of his career in a way that the abstract damage of compromised programs and wasted technical intelligence never quite manages. The American intelligence community learned of these losses relatively quickly, in the sense that the disappearance and presumed arrest and execution of Martinov and Motorin was understood by 1987 to represent a catastrophic failure of source protection. What was not understood was the cause. The question of why two FBI-handled assets inside the KGB's Washington residency had been compromised in such close succession, and in the same narrow window following the 1985 spring, was one that analysts and counterintelligence investigators would work on for years. The obvious hypothesis, that there was a leak somewhere inside the American intelligence apparatus, was immediately on the table. The more challenging work was identifying where in that apparatus the leak was located, because the list of people with access to both Martinov and Motorin's identities was not short, and the search for a specific culprit inside it proved, for reasons that the subsequent history illuminates painfully, to extend far beyond what anyone initially anticipated. The investigation that followed the 1987 losses was, by various accounts, hampered from the beginning by the institutional reluctance of the FBI to seriously consider that one of its own serving officers might be the source. The CIA, which had co-handled several of the compromised assets, was viewed as the more probable origin of any leak in the early phases of the investigation. This was not entirely without basis. The CIA had significant internal security problems of its own, as Ames's eventual exposure would confirm, but the assumption that the problem lay outside the FBI rather than within it was precisely the kind of institutional blind spot that Hanssen had identified as the most reliable protection of his operation. He knew the FBI's investigative logic. He knew how it approached the problem of identifying intelligence losses and how it prioritized hypotheses about sources. He knew this because it was his professional knowledge base, the same analytical framework that guided his own legitimate work, and he had constructed his operational security in explicit response to it. The FBI was not looking inside itself with any real seriousness in the late 1980s, and Hanssen, who had been the first to understand that it wouldn't, was using that knowledge to stay operational. What he was also using in these years was his continued access to the most sensitive programs the American intelligence community was running, not just the human assets whose fates had already been sealed, but the technical programs, the classified infrastructure, and the policy frameworks that constituted the broader architecture of American intelligence capability. The three condemned men were the most human face of what he was doing. But the full scope of his betrayal in these years was considerably larger than any three names. On Sunday mornings, Robert Hanssen attended Mass. He went every week without fail, participating in the liturgy with the attentiveness of someone for whom the ritual was not a social obligation but a genuine anchor point in an otherwise complex internal life. He observed the fasts that his faith required. He went to confession at regular intervals. He prayed. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him through his religious community, a serious and committed Catholic in ways that went well beyond the nominal adherence that sustained many of his neighbors and colleagues through the habits of a culturally Catholic upbringing. His faith was something he had apparently deepened and formalized as he moved through his adult life, and at some point in the 1980s he became a member of Opus Dei, a prelature of the Catholic Church whose members commit to integrating religious practice into their professional and daily lives in specific and structured ways. The cognitive architecture required to maintain this religious identity in parallel with the acts that Hanssen was committing is something that resists easy analysis from the outside. He was not, by any evidence available, someone who rationalized his espionage as compatible with his faith through any explicit theological argument, or who experienced his double life as spiritually troubled in a way that bled into the religious practice. He appeared, to the people who knew him through Opus Dei and through his parish, to be genuinely devout. He appeared, to the people who knew him at the FBI, to be a competent and occasionally difficult professional. And he appeared, to his wife and children, to be a present and engaged father who organized the family's life around the Catholic observances that Bonnie had always considered central to what they were building together. The three images coexisted without visible conflict. This is what the psychologists found most significant and most disturbing about his case. Not that he was a hypocrite in the ordinary sense of someone who professes one thing and does another and is aware of the gap between them, but that the compartmentalization appeared to be genuine. The Robert Hanssen who sat in the pew on Sunday was not performing piety over a private awareness of its irony. He was, at that moment, fully occupying the identity of the devout Catholic family man. The Robert Hanssen who prepared packages for the KGB dead drops was, at those moments, fully occupying a different identity. The two did not seem to interfere with each other in the normal emotional way that would produce visible strain or inconsistency. This kind of extreme compartmentalization is documented in the psychological literature as a recognizable pattern, though its degree in Hanssen's case was exceptional. It allowed him to function as a skilled counterintelligence professional during the working hours of his legitimate career, while simultaneously running a counterintelligence operation against the same organization from the inside. It allowed him to be genuinely present in his family, while carrying knowledge that would have destroyed his family's world if it became generally known. And it allowed him to maintain the exterior of a man at peace with himself, which is perhaps the most operationally useful psychological characteristic a long-term spy can possess. The contradictions of his private life extended beyond the religious dimension into territory that was stranger and, in retrospect, more revealing of the specific nature of his character. At some point in the late 1980s, Hanssen began a relationship with a woman named Priscilla Sue Anderson, who worked as a dancer at a Washington area strip club. He had encountered her in circumstances that are somewhat vaguely documented, and the relationship that developed over the following months and years was unusual in almost every dimension that can be described. He gave her money. He gave her a used Mercedes-Benz. He took her to jewelry stores and bought her gifts. He financed what he described to her as an effort to help her improve her circumstances, and he did this over a sustained period that included, at one point, taking her on a trip to Hong Kong. He introduced her to his children. He allowed her to see his home and neighborhood in Vienna, Virginia. He spoke to her about his work, not in specific enough terms to constitute a classified disclosure in the most technical sense, but in suggestive enough terms that she understood something about the nature of what he did that went beyond his public job title. What the relationship was not, according to both of them consistently and repeatedly across the years in which it was examined, was sexual. Hanssen maintained that his involvement with Priscilla Anderson was pastoral, that he saw in her someone whose circumstances required assistance and whose potential he was trying to cultivate. Anderson, for her part, confirmed this account. The relationship was eventually suspended when she relapsed into drug use, and Hanssen, apparently concluding that his investment had not produced the transformation he had hoped for, withdrew his support. The relationship has attracted significant analytical attention from the people who have studied Hanssen intensively, not because of its specific content but because of what it reveals about the broader structure of his psychology. He was a man of considerable disciplined intelligence who was drawn to a kind of chaotic and transgressive proximity, to a world that existed at a deliberate remove from the orderly Catholic domestic life he maintained in Vienna, without apparently allowing that proximity to materially compromise either the controlled exterior or the operational security of his parallel professional existence. He wanted, it seems, to inhabit the edge of danger without actually crossing it, or at least to maintain that posture in this particular context. With the KGB, of course, he was crossing it every time. But the strip club relationship, the international trip, the gifts and the money paid to a woman whose world was as far from Opus Dei and morning mass as could reasonably be arranged. These were expressions of something he needed that the two visible lives did not provide. Some investigators and psychologists who have written about him suggest that the Priscilla Anderson relationship reveals the same need that motivated the espionage itself. The desire to occupy a space that was exclusively his own, that no one in his sanctioned life could see or access or diminish. The counterintelligence operation he was running was, in the deepest sense, a private world. The friendship with Anderson was another private world. Both were maintained with care and secrecy. Both provided him with something the visible lives could not. At home, during these years, Hanssen was by many accounts a recognizable, if sometimes difficult, presence. The family lived in Vienna, Virginia, in a house on Talisman Drive that was modestly sized relative to what a senior FBI agent's salary could support, because Hanssen was careful not to allow the additional income from his Soviet payments to manifest in observable ways. The children attended Catholic school. Bonnie managed the household with the disciplined faith that had always characterized her, apparently operating under the continuing assumption that the events of 1981 had represented a concluded chapter rather than a pause in an ongoing story. Whether she had any further suspicions in the years that followed the 1981 discovery and the confessional intervention, she never publicly confirmed. Her silence on the matter, maintained consistently from her husband's arrest in 2001 through the years of his imprisonment, is itself a form of information that the historical record must accommodate without being able to fully decipher. Hanssen's relationship with his children was real in the sense that he was physically present and engaged in their Catholic education and upbringing. He coached youth sports for a period. He was present at family meals. He maintained the outward structure of what it meant to be the father of a Catholic household in a Northern Virginia suburb in the 1980s. None of his children, as far as any evidence indicates, had any awareness of what their father was actually doing. And what their father was actually doing during these same years was maintaining one of the most significant espionage operations in American history at the level of sustained productivity that the KGB found remarkable enough to note in its internal assessments. He was not slowing down. He was not becoming careless. As the years of the relationship extended and the payments accumulated and the dead drops multiplied across the parks and wooded signposts of the Virginia suburbs, Hanssen's operation was producing a volume and quality of intelligence that the KGB regarded as among the highest value streams coming from any American source. His value was compounded by the fact that he was also, simultaneously, a senior FBI counterintelligence officer whose understanding of how the American side might eventually start looking for him allowed him to anticipate and preempt precisely the investigative approaches most likely to find him. He was, in the fullest sense, living two lives. The outer life was structured, devout, professionally credible, and personally engaged. The inner life was complex, secret, financially rewarding, and built on a foundation of systematic betrayal that extended back nearly a decade. Both were real. Both were inhabited with commitment. The gap between them was not the gap of performance over truth, but the gap of two truths maintained in strict separation, neither of which, from the inside of each compartment, appeared to contradict the other. The question of how sustainable this could ever be is one to which Hanssen himself provided, over time, something approaching an answer. He understood, on some level, that it would end. He had said as much in his way when he was arrested. The question he asked at Foxstone Park was not the question of someone surprised by the concept of discovery. It was the question of someone who had factored discovery into the calculation from the beginning and had been curious, in the same analytical way he was curious about everything, about how long the curve would extend. There is a particular category of intelligence that governments guard more closely than any other, more closely than the identities of human agents or the details of diplomatic communications or even the contents of leadership deliberations. It is the intelligence that concerns their own capabilities, what they can do, how they do it, and where the limits of doing it lie. When an adversary learns this kind of information, the damage is not a specific operational failure that can be addressed and recovered from. The damage is structural, affecting the entire framework within which all other intelligence is collected and analyzed. It is the foundation being corrupted rather than a single room within the house. Robert Hanssen provided this category of intelligence to the Soviet Union and to Russia more consistently, more specifically, and over a longer period than almost anyone in the history of American espionage. The three condemned agents were the most immediate human face of what he did, and in terms of the moral weight of specific acts, they remain its center of gravity. But in terms of the institutional and strategic damage, the most devastating of Hanssen's disclosures were the ones that struck at the technical and programmatic infrastructure of American intelligence itself. Among the most operationally significant was a program involving a tunnel. In the mid-1980s, as the Soviet Union was constructing a new embassy complex on Wisconsin Avenue in northwest Washington, American intelligence identified an extraordinary opportunity. The embassy construction required extensive underground cabling for communications, and during the construction phase there was a theoretical window during which an underground passage, carefully engineered, might be positioned to allow American signals intelligence equipment to tap into those communication lines and intercept Soviet diplomatic and intelligence traffic at source. The operation was authorized. The tunnel was dug. The engineering required to accomplish this without detection was substantial, conducted under cover of unrelated construction in the neighboring area, and the investment in the project, in terms of equipment, personnel, and the months of careful work required to complete it without triggering Soviet awareness, represented an enormous commitment of resources by the FBI and the National Security Agency. By most accounts, the cost of the tunnel project, including the development of the intercept equipment and the construction work required to put it in place, ran to figures that were substantial even relative to the classified intelligence community's considerable budget. Some accounts have placed the total investment at close to $1 billion, though the exact figure remains classified. The tunnel was operational by approximately the mid-1980s. It was, or should have been, one of the most significant signals intelligence collection assets the United States had positioned against Soviet communications in Washington. Hanssen told the KGB about the tunnel in his initial round of communications in 1985, in the same early period during which he provided the three names that would lead to the deaths of Martinov and Motorin. He described it with the precision that characterized all his disclosures. The location, the operational intent, the technical capability, sufficient detail for the KGB to understand what they were dealing with without any doubt about whether the intelligence was accurate. The Soviets made a decision that was, in retrospect, as operationally sophisticated as Hanssen's original disclosure. They did not immediately shut down the tunnel construction or take dramatic action that would reveal they knew about it. They took countermeasures that effectively neutralized the tunnel's collection potential, routing sensitive communications through other channels, ensuring that the lines accessible via the tunnel carried traffic of limited intelligence value, while allowing the infrastructure to continue existing as if it were unknown to them. This approach had two advantages. It denied the United States the intercepted traffic it had built the tunnel to collect, and it prevented the Americans from knowing that their capability had been compromised, which meant they were not looking for the source of the compromise. The result was a technical intelligence operation of staggering American investment that produced essentially nothing, because from the moment it became operational its existence was known to the service it was designed to target. The Soviets allowed the tunnel to run quietly in the background, collecting unusable signal, while the Americans continued to maintain it under the impression that it was merely a slow-burning intelligence asset waiting for the right operational circumstances to justify the investment. It was not. It was a monument to one of the most costly intelligence betrayals in American history. Sitting in the ground beneath a Washington street, its existence disclosed by a man who had spent the previous decade learning exactly what to give away and how to give it away without being found. Beyond the tunnel, Hanssen provided the KGB with documents and information relating to nuclear war planning, specifically to the strategic frameworks and operational plans that the United States maintained for conducting or responding to nuclear conflict. These were among the most closely held documents in the government's classified holdings, maintained in facilities with extraordinary access controls and handled by a tiny number of people with the relevant clearances. Hanssen's access to some of this material came through his bureau work and through the interagency contacts that his seniority and analytical reputation had built over years. He did not have access to the full nuclear war planning infrastructure, but what he did have access to was sufficiently detailed and sensitive that Soviet military planners receiving it through the KGB channel would have found it materially useful in understanding American strategic thinking. He also provided intelligence about the signals intelligence capabilities of the National Security Agency, specifically about methods used to intercept and analyze Soviet communications and about the analytical techniques that allowed NSA to extract usable information from encrypted traffic. This category of intelligence is valued by adversaries because understanding how your communications are being intercepted allows you to improve your encryption, change your communication patterns, or simply stop transmitting information you don't want the other side to read. The practical effect of an adversary learning your signals intelligence collection methods is that those methods stop working, often without any dramatic announcement of the discovery, the silence on the intercepted channel being the only evidence that something has changed. Hanssen also disclosed, in various communications over the years, the identities of a number of KGB officers operating under diplomatic cover in Washington who were subjects of FBI surveillance. These were people the Bureau had identified as intelligence officers and was actively monitoring. Replacing the monitoring with the awareness that the monitored individuals knew they were being watched, and had presumably adjusted their behavior accordingly, degraded the quality of the FBI's own counterintelligence operation against the Soviet residency. There is also a disclosure that reveals something specific about how Hanssen regarded his own organization and his own colleagues. At one point he informed the KGB about an American intelligence officer who had made an approach to Soviet intelligence. An officer who was, as best as investigators later determined, either conducting an authorized dangle, a deliberate approach designed to see how the Soviets responded, or who had taken an unauthorized initiative of uncertain intent. By providing the Soviets with information about this approach, Hanssen allowed them to identify the officer and understand the nature of the contact in a way that would otherwise have remained opaque to them. Whether his disclosure prevented an American intelligence operation from developing or simply handed the Soviets information about an individual they might otherwise have tried to cultivate is a question that the available record does not fully answer. What it does answer is that Hanssen was willing and able to monitor and betray the operational activities of his own colleagues when those activities intersected with the world he was privately navigating. The total accounting of what Hanssen provided over his career has never been fully declassified. The damage assessments produced in the years after his arrest remain, in their most detailed form, classified documents to which the public does not have access. What has been released or acknowledged publicly represents a partial picture, summarized in the Justice Department's Inspector General report and in the criminal indictment and subsequent court filings. The partial picture is itself extraordinary in scale. The full picture, known only to the small community of intelligence professionals and government lawyers who have seen the complete assessments, is by all indications considerably worse. What can be said with certainty is that the intelligence Robert Hanssen provided to the Soviet Union and Russia across his career placed him in the highest tier of damaging American spies, a category occupied by very few people in the history of American intelligence. The comparison to Aldrich Ames is frequently made, partly because both were active in overlapping periods and both caused catastrophic damage, and partly because the separate but parallel operations they ran against American intelligence during the same years illuminate something arresting about the vulnerability of the institutions they betrayed. If one insider could do this, the standard argument goes, then finding one is not sufficient protection against the possibility that there are more. That specific anxiety, which the Hanssen case made concrete and unavoidable, was one of the lasting institutional legacies of his career. He received, over the full course of his espionage from 1979 to 2001, approximately $1.5 million in cash and diamonds. He spent this money carefully, keeping it in cash rather than banking it in ways that would create a traceable financial record, and he was conspicuously non-extravagant in his observable spending during the years of his active operation. No Jaguar, no vacation home, no tailored suits. The FBI family in the modest house in Vienna, with the Catholic school tuitions and the normal suburban expenses, was the economically plausible cover for a man who was providing intelligence in exchange for amounts of money that would have been conspicuous if they had surfaced in his lifestyle. They did not surface. He was, in this respect as in others, disciplined to a degree that reflected the intelligence professional he genuinely was. $1.5 million for 22 years of the most valuable espionage in American history. The ratio is one of the more striking figures in the damage assessment, not because the number seems small in absolute terms, but because it seems small relative to the cost of what was lost. The tunnel alone cost more. The value of the intelligence programs he compromised cost more. The lives of the executed agents cannot be priced at all. For $1.5 million in cash and diamonds, the Soviet Union received a strategic intelligence advantage against its primary adversary that money cannot fully denominate. By 1991, the Soviet Union that Robert Hanssen had spent 12 years of his professional life betraying was coming apart at the seams it had maintained through 7 decades of enforced cohesion. The process was visible first in the satellite states in Warsaw and Prague and Budapest and Berlin, where the populations that had organized their public lives around the necessity of accommodation with Soviet power found, with a speed that surprised everyone including themselves, that the power was withdrawing. The Berlin Wall had come down in November of 1989, and the images of people dismantling it with hammers and their bare hands carried a symbolic weight that was felt in every intelligence agency in the Western world as an announcement that the framework of the Cold War was shifting in fundamental ways. In Moscow, the shift was more turbulent. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, intended to modernize and stabilize the Soviet system, had instead accelerated its dissolution, and the attempted coup against Gorbachev in August 1991, staged by hardliners who understood that reform meant the end of what they had built, failed within days in a manner that demonstrated the exhaustion of the old order's willingness to enforce itself. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament, the coup collapsed, and by December of 1991 the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics had formally ceased to exist. 15 republics declared independence. The red flag over the Kremlin came down. The state that had organized the logic of the Cold War, that had built the KGB and the GRU and the nuclear arsenal and the intelligence apparatus that Robert Hanssen had served from inside the organization designed to counter it, that state was gone. For Hanssen, the Soviet collapse presented a practical question that he handled in the same manner he usually handled operational decisions. He made a calculation and acted on it. At some point in 1991, he stopped making contact with his handlers. The decision was not preceded by any announcement or formal conclusion to the relationship. He simply ceased the dead drop activity, left no signal indicating a package was waiting at the designated locations, and allowed the operational channel to go dormant. His reasons, as reconstructed from his later statements, were a mixture of the practical and the circumstantial. The organization he had been working with had, in the formal sense, ceased to exist. The KGB was being reorganized and reconstituted under new institutional labels that obscured but did not eliminate its operational continuity. The people who had managed his file were being reorganized into different agencies, some of whom would eventually coalesce into the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Service that was Russia's successor to the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate. The continuity of the relationship's human infrastructure was uncertain, and uncertainty in Hanssen's operational calculus was a reason for caution. There were also personal and professional considerations that influenced the pause. He was now in his late 40s, had been an intelligence officer for more than 15 years, and was watching the post-Cold War landscape take shape with the analytical attention that was his professional habit. The intelligence work being done by both sides was reconfiguring. Russian intelligence, operating under new institutional names and with a budget that had been dramatically compressed by the economic chaos following the Soviet collapse, was less capable and less reliable as a partner in the immediate post-Soviet years. The value of what he could offer was temporarily diminished by the fact that the organization receiving it was in a period of organizational upheaval. He was also aware, at some level, that the period following the Soviet collapse was a time of unusual intelligence activity, a time when former Soviet officers, finding themselves in organizations that could no longer pay their salaries reliably and in a country whose ideological framework had collapsed, were particularly likely to approach Western intelligence with offers of cooperation or information. This was a time of maximum exposure for anyone whose name appeared in Soviet intelligence files, because those files were, in some cases, becoming available to the kinds of former Soviet officers who were now willing to sell them. The prudent response was to wait and allow the landscape to settle before deciding whether to continue. The pause lasted, by most reconstructions, approximately through the early to mid-1990s. During this period, Hanssen continued his FBI career, continued attending Mass, continued maintaining the daily life of the house on Talisman Drive, and watched from inside the intelligence community as the professional landscape reorganized itself around the absence of the adversary that had defined its purpose for 4 decades. The FBI's counterintelligence division, which had spent most of its institutional existence focused on the Soviet threat, was in its own process of reconfiguring. What did counterintelligence mean when the Soviet Union was no longer the Soviet Union, and when the Russian Federation was simultaneously a former adversary, a potential partner in certain contexts, and an active intelligence competitor whose agenda was unclear? In February 1994, the answer to at least one dimension of this question arrived in a form that was dramatically clarifying. Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who had been spying for the Soviet Union and then for Russia since 1985, was arrested by the FBI after a years-long investigation. The Ames arrest was, in the immediate context, a significant intelligence and law enforcement success. A major mole inside the CIA had been identified and removed. The damage assessment that followed the arrest was sobering, documenting the loss of multiple human sources and the compromise of numerous intelligence operations over 9 years. Within the intelligence community, the arrest was received with the mixed emotions of an institution discovering that one of its own had done enormous damage, while also being relieved that the leaking had been found and stopped. There was, however, a problem. As the intelligence community worked through the full accounting of what Ames had compromised and compared it against the record of intelligence losses that had accumulated over the years, certain things did not match. Specific operational failures and source compromises that had occurred before Ames's 1985 activation date could not be attributed to him. Other losses in the late 1980s were partially explained by Ames but not fully. The pattern of damage was too extensive, too widespread across too many agencies and programs to be the work of a single source inside the CIA. There was something else. There was someone else. This realization, which the intelligence community arrived at gradually and uneasily in the mid-1990s, should have produced an aggressive new phase of mole hunting. In some respects it did. Investigative resources were assigned to the problem of identifying additional sources of the unexplained losses. Analytical work was done to create a picture of what the unknown source's profile might look like, what access they would need to have had, What institutional position would explain the range of material that had been compromised? The investigative process that followed is one of the most troubling chapters in the history of American counterintelligence, partly because of what it got wrong and partly because of what that error reveals about the institutional biases that Hanssen had understood and exploited from the beginning. The focus of the investigation, for most of the mid to late 1990s, fell on a CIA officer named Brian Kelly. Kelly had certain characteristics that fit the investigative profile that analysts had developed for the hypothetical unknown source. His access patterns overlapped with some of the compromised material. Certain behaviors were interpreted, through the lens of the investigation's existing hypothesis, as consistent with someone conducting clandestine communications with a foreign intelligence service. Kelly was surveilled. His movements were tracked, his communications monitored, his personal and professional life examined with the thoroughness that any serious counterintelligence investigation brings to a serious target. FBI agents deployed the tradecraft of counterintelligence against a CIA officer who was, in fact, innocent of the specific crimes he was suspected of. His career was disrupted and his life was upended by an investigation that drove deep into his personal and professional world for years and concluded, eventually and without the evidence that would have been decisive, that Kelly was probably the source. The focus on Kelly, wrong as it was, served Hanssen's continued operation in a specific and measurable way. The investigative attention of the Bureau's mole-hunting resources was directed toward the CIA and toward a specific individual inside it, rather than toward the FBI's own counterintelligence division, where the actual source continued to work and to plan his return to active espionage. Sometime in the late 1990s, Robert Hanssen decided the pause had been long enough. The Russian SVR had reconstituted itself from the wreckage of the KGB with enough organizational continuity that the operational infrastructure for resuming the relationship could be reconstructed. The dead-drop procedures, the communication protocols, the signal systems that had worked for years in the Virginia suburbs could be reactivated. He was approaching the end of his FBI career, moving toward the retirement age that would eventually close his access to the classified material that gave the relationship its value. If he was going to resume, this was the time. He resumed. The FBI has never been an organization comfortable with the concept of its own institutional failure. This is not a unique characteristic. Most large bureaucratic institutions resist the framing of systemic failure in favor of the framing of anomalous individual failure, the bad actor who slipped through rather than the structure that permitted the slipping. But in the specific context of counterintelligence, the FBI's resistance to internal scrutiny carried a particular operational cost, because the hypothesis that an FBI officer might be the source of the unexplained intelligence losses was precisely the hypothesis that the FBI's investigative culture was least equipped to take seriously. The mole hunt that followed the discovery, accelerating in the mid-1990s after the Ames arrest made clear that he could not explain all the damage, was conducted against this institutional headwind. The investigators assigned to the problem worked with genuine professional commitment, but they were working within a framework of assumptions that preloaded the search in specific directions. Toward the CIA, toward contractors and consultants with access to sensitive material, toward the peripheral edges of the classified world rather than toward its center. The possibility that the source was inside the FBI's own counterintelligence division, that the person who had betrayed agents and programs and technical capabilities was someone who attended the same meetings and held the same clearances as the investigators hunting him, was a hypothesis that required overcoming a very significant institutional reluctance. The investigation used a profiling approach, building a statistical and analytical picture of what the unknown source would have to look like based on the known damage. What access would have been required to compromise the specific material that had been lost? What institutional position would explain the range of programs affected? What timeline of access matched the timeline of the losses that couldn't be attributed to Ames? The profile that emerged was not wrong, in the sense that it described characteristics that were consistent with a senior FBI counterintelligence officer. What the investigation did with that profile, however, was to discount the FBI-specific hypothesis in favor of the CIA target that seemed, based on partially evaluated evidence, to fit well enough. Brian Kelly was a CIA officer who had spent his career in counterintelligence work, who had access to material that overlapped with some of the compromised intelligence, and who had certain behavioral patterns that, interpreted through the lens of a committed investigation, could be read as consistent with clandestine communication. He was, in the clinical sense, a plausible hypothesis. The investigation developed its case around this hypothesis and pursued it with the resources and tradecraft that the Bureau brought to serious counterintelligence investigations. What investigators did not find, despite years of sustained effort, was the definitive evidence that would have made the Kelly case prosecutable or conclusive. They found circumstantial material. They found behaviors that were suspicious in the specific interpretive context of the investigation. They did not find the communications, the financial transactions, or the direct operational contacts that would have placed Kelly in the chain of actual disclosure. This should have triggered a serious re-examination of the hypothesis. Instead, the investigation's momentum, the considerable institutional and professional investment that had accumulated in the Kelly theory, made a pivot toward alternative hypotheses procedurally and psychologically difficult. Kelly lived under this investigative shadow for years. His career was effectively frozen. He was denied promotions, excluded from sensitive work, and subjected to the kind of sustained attention that an innocent person experiencing but unable to disprove a serious accusation finds both humiliating and professionally destructive. His colleagues watched him with the particular wariness that attaches to someone who has been designated as a suspect by authoritative institutional judgment, even unofficial judgment, and the social consequences of that wariness were real and lasting. The institutional failure that produced the wrong focus on Kelly and the effective non-focus on Hanssen was dissected at length in the post-arrest reports published by the Justice Department and in the investigative accounts of journalists and former intelligence officers who covered the story. The conclusions they reached pointed to several reinforcing factors that all operated in Hanssen's favor throughout the course of the mole hunt. The first was the FBI's structural reluctance to investigate its own. The Bureau could investigate the CIA aggressively and did so with considerable institutional ease, because the CIA was a different agency, its personnel a different category of personnel, and the possibility of failure there was not a reflection on the FBI. Directing the same aggressive investigative attention toward the FBI's own counterintelligence division required a willingness to contemplate institutional self-examination that the Bureau's culture made genuinely difficult. The second was Hanssen's active operational contribution to his own protection. He was not merely the passive beneficiary of the Bureau's investigative blind spots. He used his professional knowledge of counterintelligence methods to anticipate what the investigation would look for and to ensure that his operation did not produce the signatures that the investigation was calibrated to find. He did not live extravagantly. He did not maintain face-to-face contact with his handlers. He did not communicate by telephone or email. He did not receive funds through any traceable financial channel. His operational security was constructed precisely to defeat the investigative approaches most likely to be applied to someone in his position, because those investigative approaches were the professional tools of his legitimate career. The third factor was that Hanssen had extraordinary access to the investigation itself. As a senior counterintelligence officer at the FBI, he was in a position to receive information about the progress of the mole hunt, about what leads were being pursued and what evidence was being evaluated. There is specific evidence, established in the post-arrest investigation, that he accessed files at the Bureau that he was not authorized to access, reviewing investigative material related to ongoing counterintelligence cases that were not within his official purview. He was, in effect, monitoring his own pursuit while it was underway, adjusting his operation in response to whatever the investigative record revealed about where the hunt was looking. This particular dimension of his operation, the use of his own professional access to surveil the people surveilling for him, was perhaps the most striking expression of the specific advantage that an insider spy possesses over any external adversary. A foreign intelligence officer who wanted to understand the state of the FBI's mole hunt would have faced significant obstacles. Hanssen simply looked it up. The mole hunt continued through the late 1990s without resolution, with Kelly as the primary focus of investigative attention and with Hanssen continuing to operate. He had re-established his Russian SVR contacts after the pause of the early 1990s and was once again passing material through the dead drop system in the Northern Virginia parks. The investigation that was designed to find him was looking in the wrong direction, and the man it was designed to find was sitting inside the institution conducting the hunt, reading the reports and making adjustments. There was one investigation that came closer to the truth than the Kelly-focused effort. In the mid-1990s, an internal FBI review looked specifically at anomalies in access records within the Bureau's counterintelligence division, examining cases where officers had accessed files or systems outside their normal operational purview. The review identified certain anomalies associated with Hanssen's access patterns. The anomalies were noted. The review concluded without producing a serious investigative action against him. There were also subordinates and colleagues at the FBI who, at various points during Hanssen's career, found his behavior puzzling or concerning. One incident, discussed in accounts of his career and in post-arrest investigations, involved a colleague who discovered Hanssen accessing a computer system in a classified environment in a way that was not consistent with his official assignments. The discovery was reported. It did not produce an investigation. The institutional response was the institutional response that Hanssen had always counted on, the assumption that whatever he was doing had an innocent explanation, because he was Robert Hanssen of the FBI's counterintelligence division, and the alternative explanation was too uncomfortable to fully entertain. By the late 1990s, the investigation into the unexplained intelligence losses was at a point of stalemate. The wrong hypothesis had consumed years of investigative effort without producing a prosecutable case, and the right hypothesis remained largely unexplored. The FBI's counterintelligence division had a senior officer who had been systematically compromising American intelligence operations for nearly 2 decades, and the Bureau was no closer to identifying him than it had been when the first indicators of catastrophic loss had appeared in the late 1980s. He was still working. He was still attending Mass. He was still making his Sunday drives to the parks of Northern Virginia. And somewhere in Russia, in the files of the SVR that had received more than 20 years of American intelligence courtesy of an FBI counterintelligence specialist, a dossier marked by a name that its subject had never provided in person was growing steadily thicker. If the question of how Robert Hanssen survived as long as he did has a single most revealing answer, it is not found in his extraordinary operational security, or in the institutional failures that directed investigative attention away from him, or even in his own professional sophistication about the methods his pursuers were likely to employ. The most revealing answer is found in the specific incidents where he was detected, where colleagues noticed something wrong, where his behavior produced the kind of anomalous result that a properly functioning security apparatus should have resolved into action, and where the institutional response was to look away. These moments existed. They are documented. And the fact that each of them passed without serious consequence tells you more about the organizational culture that Hanssen had correctly identified as his most durable protection than any description of his own tradecraft could convey. The most significant of these incidents, in terms of what it should have triggered and didn't, occurred during an assignment at FBI headquarters in Washington. Hanssen was working in a posting that gave him access to sensitive analytical files, and at some point a supervisor on the floor discovered him in proximity to a filing cabinet or safe to which he had no authorized access. The exact details of the specific incident vary somewhat across the accounts that have reconstructed it, but the core fact is established. A senior FBI officer was found accessing or attempting to access classified material outside his authorized purview, was observed by a superior, and reported. The report went into the system. It was reviewed. The conclusion, apparently, was that whatever the incident represented, it did not rise to the level of a formal counterintelligence investigation of a senior agent with Hanssen's seniority and record. The institutional logic that produced this conclusion is recognizable from the outside, even if from the inside it represents a decision that investigators would later characterize as profoundly wrong. Robert Hanssen was a supervisory special agent with more than a decade in the Bureau's counterintelligence division. He had a record of professional competence. He was known to be sometimes difficult and occasionally arrogant, but there is a significant difference between an officer who is difficult to work with and an officer who presents a counterintelligence risk, and the Bureau's culture, which did not find it easy to look seriously at its own senior people, defaulted to the former characterization and left the latter alone. The observation was noted, The note went into a file, and Hanssen continued his career without further consequence from the incident. There was also the matter of computers. Hanssen had been an early and sophisticated user of computing technology within the FBI, and he had advocated for the Bureau's adoption of computer-based intelligence analysis in ways that were ahead of the institutional curve. He genuinely understood what digital systems could do, and he used that understanding in his espionage as effectively as in his legitimate work. At some point, a colleague observed Hanssen accessing a computer system in a manner that did not correspond to his official tasks. The colleague noted this, apparently found it concerning enough to mention, and this too entered the institutional record without generating an investigation. There is also the specific question of his financial conduct. Hanssen maintained his spending at levels consistent with a federal agent's salary throughout his career, which was a deliberate operational precaution, but he did not have zero financial anomalies. He paid Catholic school tuitions for 6 children in full while living on a government salary. He drove a relatively modest car. But he also made certain purchases and payments that, examined closely, were not fully consistent with his documented income. No one at the FBI appears to have examined them closely. The specific financial monitoring that might have flagged these inconsistencies was not applied, partly because the FBI's culture at this period did not routinely subject its own officers to the kind of financial scrutiny that the CIA applied to its personnel after the Ames revelations. The Ames case, which broke dramatically in 1994, should have triggered exactly this kind of enhanced internal scrutiny across both the CIA and the FBI. The CIA responded with significant internal security reforms, including much more aggressive financial monitoring of its personnel and regular polygraph examinations with broader scope. The FBI's response was less comprehensive, partly because the Ames affair was seen within the Bureau as a CIA problem, confirmation of the CIA's institutional security failures, rather than evidence of a broader vulnerability that applied equally to the FBI. This reading was convenient and wrong, and the specific consequence of its wrongness was that the financial monitoring, the access auditing, and the personnel security measures that might have caught Hanssen were not systematically implemented in the years when they would have mattered. Hanssen was, in fact, given a polygraph examination at some point in his career. He passed it. This is less surprising than it might initially appear. The polygraph, which detects physiological stress responses associated with deception, is a tool of limited reliability for detecting individuals with Hanssen's specific psychological profile. People whose compartmentalization is so complete that the act of denial does not produce the normal physiological stress response because it is not, at the moment of the test in the operative psychological sense, experienced as a lie. The evidence on polygraph reliability for experienced intelligence officers who have been trained in or who have naturally developed the capacity for extreme psychological compartmentalization is equivocal, and Hanssen's case is frequently cited in the literature on the subject as an example of the specific category of individual for whom the instrument fails most completely. He also had, through most of his career, institutional status that served as informal protection against the kind of serious scrutiny that a junior officer displaying the same anomalous behaviors might have attracted. There is a specific dynamic in large institutional environments where seniority accumulates a protective penumbra. The senior person is assumed to have a legitimate explanation for behaviors that would be questioned without the assumption, and the questioning itself requires overcoming the social and institutional weight of challenging someone who outranks you. Hanssen used his seniority consciously. He projected intellectual authority in a way that made challenging his judgment or his access patterns feel like a statement about the challenger's own inadequacy rather than about a reasonable operational concern. Colleagues who worked with Hanssen in various capacities over the years and who later reflected on their experience of him in the post-arrest context described a consistent quality. He could make you feel that noticing something about him was itself evidence that you were not thinking clearly. The slight edge of condescension in his manner, the precision of his responses to questions, the quality that said he had already considered whatever you were about to raise and had found it insufficiently significant to voluntarily address. These characteristics created a slight reluctance in the people around him to push on anything he seemed to regard as settled. That reluctance was, over the course of a career, worth more to him than almost any other form of operational security, because it operated at the institutional level where detection was most likely to originate. The counterintelligence debriefers who worked with Hanssen after his arrest found this quality intact even then. He was cooperative within his cooperation agreement, technically responsive to questions within the limits he had set, and at every point the master of the tone of the interaction in a way that suggested the arrangement, even the arrangement of his own debriefing in the custody of the people who had caught him, was proceeding on his terms. He had been caught, but he had not been cracked open, and the distinction between those two things was one that he maintained with characteristic precision. In a career of close calls, not one of them came close enough to create the investigative momentum that might have shortened it. The supervisor who found him in unauthorized access. The colleague who noticed the computer use. The financial assessments that could have been made but weren't. The profile that pointed toward his position but was redirected toward Kelly. Each of these was an opportunity that the institution failed to take, and each failure represented, in the accounting of the intelligence and the lives that might have been protected, a very specific cost. He understood this. He had built his operation on the knowledge that the cost of these missed opportunities would be paid by others and never by him, at least not for as long as the institution's culture continued to function as he had observed it functioning since 1979. The question that his eventual arrest raised, and that the subsequent commission reports and institutional reforms attempted to address, was how you change an institution's culture in ways that the next Robert Hanssen cannot read and preempt. The answer, if there is one, involves exactly the kind of systematic, uncomfortable internal scrutiny that Hanssen had always correctly predicted would be the last place an American intelligence institution would willingly look. In the intelligence world, there is a category of operation that sits in a particular moral and legal ambiguity, the purchase of classified information from a foreign intelligence service's own officers. It is, in the strict bureaucratic sense, a recruitment no different in legal structure from any other development of a source. But practically and ethically it occupies different territory, because what you are often purchasing in these operations is not the officers' cooperation but their material, the files, the documents, the physical evidence accumulated in their services' archives. You are, in effect, buying the other side's reporting on their own sources and operations, paying someone to steal from their own organization in ways that serve your intelligence needs rather than theirs. The CIA conducted exactly this kind of operation sometime around the year 2000, when a Russian intelligence officer who had access to SVR files made contact with American intelligence and offered, for a price, material from the SVR's archive relating to the FBI mole the Russians had been running for years. The price he demanded was substantial. By credible accounts, the transaction totaled approximately $7 million in cash and other considerations, making it one of the more expensive single-source acquisitions in agency history. The CIA paid it. What the Russian source provided in exchange was a file on the anonymous American agent that the KGB, and then the SVR, had been running for years under the designations B and Ramon Garcia. The file contained communications material, operational records, and a description of the source's tradecraft and security practices that was, by itself, extremely valuable for understanding the scope and duration of what the source had provided. It also contained something more immediately and conclusively useful: physical evidence. Among the materials in the file was a plastic bag. The bag had been handled by the source at some point in the course of the operational relationship, and it had been retained in the file with the understanding that physical evidence of this kind, fingerprints and DNA and other biological traces, might eventually prove useful in identifying someone whose identity had otherwise been carefully protected. The bag was submitted for forensic analysis. The fingerprints on the bag were compared against the database of personnel with access to counterintelligence materials that would have matched the profile of what the source had provided. The fingerprints matched Robert Philip Hanssen. The identification was made through the FBI's personnel files, where Hanssen's fingerprints had been on record since his initial employment with the Bureau. The match was not circumstantial or probabilistic. It was definitive. The fingerprints on the plastic bag from the SVR's operational file on their long-running American source were the fingerprints of a supervisory special agent who was, at the time of the identification, still employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, still in possession of a valid security clearance, and still reporting to FBI headquarters in Washington for work. The moment this identification was established, the investigative picture that had been building for years resolved into sudden, specific clarity. The unattributed intelligence losses. The source profile that pointed toward a senior counterintelligence officer with multi-agency access. The patterns that had been partially visible and then obscured by the focus on Kelly. All of it collapsed into a single name, which was the name attached to those fingerprints, which was the name of a man who had been sitting inside the counterintelligence division for more than 2 decades while the Bureau looked for someone else. The discovery created an immediate and delicate problem. The investigation now had a definitively identified target, but the process of building the case to a prosecutable standard, and of executing the arrest in a way that did not risk alerting the target or compromising the evidence, required extraordinary operational care. Hanssen was a counterintelligence professional who understood exactly what an investigation against him would look like, who had demonstrated over years the capacity to monitor his own investigative environment, and who had access to Bureau systems that would, if not carefully managed, allow him to see indicators of increased interest in his activities. The team assembled to develop the case against Hanssen was small by design, tightly compartmentalized in a specific acknowledgement of the risk that he might still have access to Bureau systems that could reveal the investigation's existence. The compartmentalization was unusually strict. The people working the case were limited in number. Their communications about the target were conducted through channels that Hanssen could not access through his normal Bureau work, and the decision to proceed to arrest was made with attention to both the evidentiary standard and the operational security requirements simultaneously. The first task was to confirm the fingerprint identification through additional evidence, and to begin building the documentation of Hanssen's operational activities that would be required for prosecution. The FBI had the SVR file with the fingerprint evidence, which was compelling but had limitations as a standalone piece of evidence given its provenance. Evidence obtained by purchasing it from a foreign intelligence services officer is not evidence obtained through the standard collection methods that American courts handle most routinely. The prosecution needed more, obtained through methods whose chain of custody could withstand scrutiny. The investigation began to document Hanssen's current activities, watching discreetly as he returned to his pattern of dead drop activity in the Northern Virginia parks. Surveillance was established with the operational care appropriate to a target who was himself a surveillance professional, who knew how surveillance was conducted and what its signatures looked like, and who had spent 20 years evading exactly this kind of attention. The surveillance teams were experienced and careful, working in the knowledge that the target was not a foreign national operating in an unfamiliar environment but an American professional who understood the rules of the game as well or better than they did. They watched him make a dead drop. They watched the location. They documented the exchange. Each time he completed a dead drop sequence, the investigation's evidentiary file grew. The behavioral evidence accumulated alongside the forensic and documentary evidence in ways that built the prosecution case brick by careful brick. One dimension of the investigation required particular delicacy. Hanssen had to be monitored in his current workplace environment, which meant that someone inside the FBI's operational sphere needed to have regular contact with him in a context that would provide both behavioral intelligence and, potentially, access to documentary evidence. The solution adopted was to create a new assignment for Hanssen, one that would simultaneously give the investigation visibility into his day-to-day activities and move him into a position where his access to certain sensitive systems could be managed without alerting him that anything had changed. In January 2001, approximately 6 weeks before the arrest that would end his career, Hanssen received notification that he was being transferred to a new position at FBI headquarters. The transfer was framed as a senior assignment, a role coordinating with private sector partners in a liaison function. It was, in the operational logic of the investigation, a carefully constructed position designed to place Hanssen in an environment the Bureau could control, watched by a person it controlled, for the duration of the time required to complete the evidentiary record and execute the arrest. The person assigned as his aide in the new position was a young FBI agent named Eric O'Neill. O'Neill was 28 years old, newly credentialed, and selected for the assignment with a cover story that presented him as a counterterrorism specialist assigned to support the senior agent. His actual role was to build rapport with Hanssen, observe his behavior, document his activities, and facilitate the physical access to Hanssen's materials that the investigation needed. He would later describe the weeks of this assignment as among the most professionally demanding of his career, maintaining the authentic presentation of a junior agent learning from a respected senior while simultaneously doing work whose real purpose Hanssen could not know. Hanssen did not warm to O'Neill immediately. He was, by O'Neill's account, suspicious of the assignment in the way that a counterintelligence professional is always mildly suspicious of sudden changes in professional environment. And he tested the younger agent in the ways that senior people test juniors when they are trying to assess whether the junior is genuine. O'Neill performed. The cover held. And through the weeks of January and into February 2001, the investigation reached the point where everything was in place. The SVR file, the fingerprints, the surveillance documentation of dead drop activity, the new assignment that had placed Hanssen in a controlled environment. The operation was ready. The only remaining question was the operational timing of the arrest itself, which would be determined by Hanssen's own activities. The weeks between Hanssen's transfer to the new liaison position in January 2001 and the arrest in February were among the most operationally intense periods of the entire investigation. Eric O'Neill was navigating a daily proximity to a man who had spent 22 years evading detection by professionals whose entire career purpose was to identify people exactly like him. The daily pressures of maintaining a convincing cover story against this kind of target, someone with the professional formation and the psychological acuity to read behavioral inconsistencies that most people would never detect, were not theoretical challenges. They were the moment-to-moment experience of being in a room with a man who was watching you as carefully as you were watching him. O'Neill later wrote and spoke extensively about his experience in this period, providing an account that was subsequently adapted for the 2007 film Breach. He described Hanssen as someone who managed the social environment of their working relationship in ways that felt controlling from the beginning, who positioned himself in the room, who managed eye contact, who gave and withheld approval in the specific manner of someone accustomed to being the dominant intelligence in any setting and to organizing the dynamics of an interaction around that dominance. Working alongside him without revealing the real nature of the assignment required the kind of complete behavioral consistency that is easy to understand in principle and extraordinarily difficult to sustain in practice. One dimension of the operation required O'Neill to obtain temporary access to Hanssen's Palm Pilot, a personal digital assistant that Hanssen carried and used to store various contacts and appointments, on the working assumption that its contents might contribute to the evidentiary record or illuminate aspects of his operation. The specific operation that produced access to the device required O'Neill to distract Hanssen while a colleague briefly examined it, and the tension of this operation is captured in O'Neill's account with the clarity of someone who understood, at the time, that the professional consequences of any error in those few minutes would be severe and immediate. The operation succeeded. The surveillance of Hanssen's activities in the Northern Virginia parks continued through February. The dead drop pattern that he maintained involved a specific set of locations that he alternated with the regularity of someone who had used them enough times to be comfortable with their security, and the investigation had built a detailed picture of those locations and the timing patterns associated with them. When Hanssen's activities indicated that he was preparing to make a drop, placing the white tape signal at a designated location in a park in the days preceding the transfer, the investigation's operational planning shifted to final execution mode. In the second week of February 2001, Hanssen placed the signal indicating that a drop would be made at Foxstone Park. The surveillance teams were notified. The arrest operation was authorized. On Sunday, February 18, 2001, Robert Hanssen drove from his house on Talisman Drive to Foxstone Park, entered the trail from the Creek Crossing Road parking area, and walked toward the wooden footbridge he had used before. He was followed every step of the way. The teams in the park that afternoon had been briefed extensively on the target and his likely responses to the arrest, and the operational plan accounted for the specific challenge of arresting a counterintelligence professional who had no reason to surrender without exhausting his assessment of the situation. The plan was to allow Hanssen to complete the retrieval, to pick up the package his handlers had left, so that the physical evidence of the exchange was in his possession at the moment of arrest, and then to close the perimeter before he could react. He reached the bridge. He bent down and retrieved the package. He turned and began walking back toward the parking area. The agents moved from their positions and converged on the path. Hanssen stopped. He took measure of what was around him, doing it with the practiced speed of a professional who has spent a career reading operational situations and whose ability to assess one had not diminished in the slightest. He looked at the agents closing in. He knew some of their faces. He knew what was happening. And he said 5 words. "What took you so long?" The search of his vehicle, a Toyota 4Runner parked at the lot, found $50,000 in cash along with materials that documented the dead drop activity. The package he had just retrieved, additional items prepared for delivery to his handlers, and physical evidence of the operational relationship that the prosecution would use extensively in the subsequent legal proceedings. The vehicle search was conducted by agents who understood they were looking at the material record of the most significant active espionage case in FBI history, and who found themselves looking at the ordinary detritus of operational routine, the cash, the packages, the mundane evidence of a transaction that had been running so long and so quietly that it had acquired the character of a regular errand. The search of his home on Talisman Drive, authorized by the warrant that had been prepared in advance, produced additional evidence. Bank records consistent with the receipt of funds not accounted for by his government salary. A storage area containing materials that were not consistent with the normal contents of a senior FBI agent's personal space. The physical documentation of a life that had been running on 2 tracks simultaneously for longer than most of the agents conducting the search had been in law enforcement. Hanssen was taken initially to FBI field offices for processing. His demeanor throughout the early hours of his arrest and custody was consistent with the profile that investigators had built over years. Controlled, linguistically precise, providing minimal information while observing maximum situational awareness. He did not immediately ask for a lawyer, which was a choice that some analysts of his psychology have interpreted as continuous with his general posture of managing the interaction on his own terms, assessing the situation before engaging any external resource that would reduce his direct control over how the conversation developed. The news of the arrest moved through the intelligence community with a speed that reflected both the sensitivity of the case and the specific shock of the identification. Senior officials at the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA found themselves confronting the documented reality of what the fingerprints in the SVR file and the 22 years of unattributed losses had always been pointing toward. One of their own, at a senior level, in a position of deep institutional trust, had been the source the entire time. The specific shock of that identification, the moment when the abstract hypothesis of a senior FBI counterintelligence officer became the specific reality of Robert Philip Hanssen, was described by the people who experienced it as one of the more jarring professional moments in the recent history of those institutions. Not because it was unprecedented in the most abstract sense. There had been traitors in American intelligence before, but because this particular person had been inside this particular organization for this particular length of time, handling this particular category of information, while the organization he served spent years looking for someone outside its own walls. The immediate priority in the hours and days after the arrest was damage assessment. What could be reconstructed of what he had provided, to whom and when? This assessment was complicated by the fact that Hanssen's operational security had always been designed to make that reconstruction difficult. He had not kept records of his activities in any form that could be easily excavated. The SVR file provided a significant documentary resource, but it was necessarily incomplete. The KGB and SVR had kept their side of the record, not his. The reconstruction depended heavily on what he could be compelled or induced to tell investigators, which brought the cooperation agreement into the center of everything that followed. The 22 years of Foxstone Park and the dead drops and the Sunday masses and the 6 children and the Opus Dei prayer groups and the $50,000 in a Toyota in a suburban parking lot had ended, definitively and without appeal, on a gray February afternoon in a park that would never be entirely unremarkable again. The federal indictment against Robert Philip Hanssen, filed in the weeks following his February 2001 arrest, charged him with 21 counts of espionage and conspiracy to commit espionage. Each count represented a documented act of betrayal, the kind of specific and proven event that could be placed before a jury and argued from evidence. Together they described, with the compressed precision of legal language, a career whose full dimensions extended well beyond what any charging document could contain. Hanssen faced the death penalty. The charges against him included counts that, under the statutory framework governing espionage, carried capital punishment as a possible sentence. He was 56 years old, in deteriorating health from the specific kind of physical decline that accompanies 2 decades of sustained stress suppressed below any visible surface, and the prospect of a capital trial, with its years of legal proceedings, its compelled testimony, and its complete public exposure of everything he had done to everyone he had harmed, confronted him with a situation whose parameters he could not fully control. He negotiated. The cooperation agreement that Hanssen reached with the Justice Department in July 2001 exchanged his detailed cooperation with the intelligence community's damage assessment for the removal of the death penalty from the charging framework. He would plead guilty to 15 counts. He would cooperate with debriefers from the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA over the months required to reconstruct as complete a picture as possible of what he had provided and to whom and when. In exchange, he would receive a sentence of life imprisonment rather than death, with no possibility of parole. The deal required cooperation that was genuine, not performative, which meant it required Hanssen to provide specifics that had operational significance. Not just the broad strokes of what he had done, but the details that could be used to assess the damage and, where possible, remediate it. The cooperation, by all accounts, was real as far as it went. He provided significant information about his tradecraft, his communication methods, his dead drop locations, and his understanding of what the material he had passed had contained and what its operational value would have been. He was precise in these areas, consistent with his general characteristic of engaging with technical and operational specifics while managing the emotional and motivational dimensions of his story with considerably more reserve. He stood before United States District Judge Claude Hilton in Alexandria, Virginia on July 6, 2001, and entered his guilty plea to the 15 counts. The courtroom in Alexandria had hosted significant espionage proceedings before. It was and is a venue with a particular history in national security cases, but the specific gravity of what was being concluded there on that July morning was felt by the people present. A 25-year veteran of the FBI who had spent the entire duration of his career in active espionage against the institution he served was entering his guilty plea, acknowledging in the formal language of the law what the SVR file and the fingerprints and the $50,000 in the parking lot had already established. On May 10, 2002, Hanssen appeared before Judge Hilton again for sentencing. The sentence imposed was 15 consecutive life terms in federal prison, plus an additional 10 years on the conspiracy counts, with no possibility of parole. The structure of the sentence, 15 terms, consecutive rather than concurrent, for 15 separate acts of espionage, was a legal articulation of the court's assessment of what the individual acts had meant and what the cumulative total of them deserved. The total imprisonment time represented by 15 consecutive life sentences is not a number that requires much interpretation. He was transported to the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility in Florence, Colorado. The facility is known informally by its abbreviated designation, ADX Florence, or occasionally as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, a nickname that reflects both its location and its function. It is the federal prison system's highest security facility, designed to house the category of prisoner whose combination of dangerousness, operational knowledge, and institutional resources makes them unsuitable for any less restrictive environment. The standard ADX Florence regime involves 23 hours per day in a cell, 1 hour of outdoor recreation in a small enclosed space, and severe restrictions on contact with the outside world. Communication with other inmates is limited by the physical layout of the facility, which is designed to prevent the social networks that form in conventional maximum security prisons. Hanssen spent the last 22 years of his life at ADX Florence. Visitors to the facility are received under strict conditions, and the public record of what his days there consisted of is limited. He retained the faith he had always claimed, continuing, within the constraints of the prison's religious programs, the Catholic practice that had organized the exterior of his life from childhood. He was reportedly in declining health in his final years, the accumulation of age and the specific physical costs of supermax confinement taking their predictable toll. On June 5, 2023, Robert Philip Hanssen died at ADX Florence. He was 79 years old. The official cause was recorded as natural causes. He had been imprisoned for 22 years, precisely mirroring, in a symmetry that no one planned, the 22 years of his active espionage career. The legacy that his case left behind is measured in several dimensions that don't reduce to each other and can't be fully added together. The institutional reforms that followed his arrest represent one dimension. The FBI implemented substantially enhanced personnel security programs in the years following 2001, including more rigorous financial monitoring of agents with access to sensitive material, more systematic polygraph schedules, improved access auditing for classified systems, and a general recalibration of the cultural assumption that the Bureau's own people were exempt from the investigative scrutiny applied to everyone else. The reforms were real and meaningful, though most security professionals acknowledge that any set of institutional reforms is a response to the previous threat vector rather than a guarantee against future ones that operate differently. The 9/11 Commission, which examined the intelligence failures surrounding the September 11th attacks, identified Hanssen's espionage as a contributing factor to the broader intelligence environment in which those failures occurred. The specific technical and operational information he had provided over the years had degraded American intelligence capabilities in ways that affected not only the Cold War adversary relationship with Russia, but the broader infrastructure of intelligence collection and analysis on which counterterrorism work depended. The Commission's conclusions on this point were somewhat cautious, acknowledging the difficulty of tracing specific causal links between intelligence degradation and specific operational failures, but the general finding was that Hanssen's comprehensive penetration of American intelligence had contributed to a landscape of diminished capability that was not fully visible to the people working within it. Brian Kelly, the CIA officer who had been wrongly focused on as the probable mole for years, received an official acknowledgement and apology from the CIA and the Justice Department after Hanssen's arrest established conclusively that Kelly had never been the source. He retired from government service, having spent the final years of his career under an investigative cloud that had not been of his making. His exoneration was complete and official, but the years of disrupted career and personal damage that the wrong investigation had produced could not be given back. Bonnie Hanssen, who had maintained her silence and her privacy from the moment of her husband's arrest, retained the pension associated with her husband's federal service and continued to live quietly. The legal and institutional questions about what she had known and when she had known it were carefully examined during the investigation and cooperation process, and the conclusion was that her knowledge did not rise to the level of criminal complicity. The specific question of how much more she understood than she acknowledged, in the years from 1981 onward, is one she took with her. The three families most directly destroyed by his espionage, the family of Valery Martinov, executed in 1987, the family of Sergei Motorin, executed in 1987, and Boris Yuzin, who survived his labor camp sentence and eventually reached the United States, each carry a version of the story that is not the institutional version. Yuzin, the one who survived, has spoken on occasion about the experience of being in a Soviet labor camp for 6 years because someone he never met had written his name in a letter, in exchange for money, to an intelligence service whose job it was to destroy him. His account carries the specific weight of a first-person survivor's testimony, the kind that resists both abstraction and closure. The question that Robert Hanssen asked as his arrest was completed, "What took you so long?" has never received a satisfying response. The answer that emerges from the full account of his career is not one that the FBI or the broader intelligence community finds comfortable to articulate, because it points not at the failure of any specific investigative operation but at the aggregate of the cultural assumptions and institutional habits that allowed one man to operate for 22 years from inside the organization designed to catch people like him. He was not caught by the FBI's counterintelligence capability. He was caught because a Russian intelligence officer decided that $7 million was a reasonable compensation for handing over a file, and because that file contained a plastic bag with fingerprints on it, and because those fingerprints were on record. The capture was purchased rather than professionally earned, the product of an adversary's internal corruption rather than the FBI's own investigative success. It is, in the final accounting, an accurate answer to his question, and it is an answer that the institutions responsible for American national security have been working ever since to make permanently obsolete. Whether they have succeeded is a question that the nature of intelligence work prevents from being answered definitively. The next Robert Hanssen, if there is one, will not operate identically. The specific vulnerabilities he exploited have been addressed. The specific cultural assumptions he relied upon have been interrogated. The specific institutional reluctance to look inward has been, at least formally, acknowledged and challenged. But the dynamics of trust and access and the particular human weakness that allows someone to convince themselves they are the exception, these things do not disappear from institutions simply because an institution decides to address them. They are structural as the need for secrecy that creates the conditions in which betrayal is possible, and as durable as the human capacity for the specific kind of self-deception that can sustain a double life, in the same house, in the same pew for 22 years. What took them so long? The question still stands. The answer is still us.